The question of the Normans, whispered through the halls of history, often boils down to a simple yet profoundly complex identity crisis. Were they descendants of Vikings or were they Europeans? One conjures images of longships and horned helmets, a chaotic force of nature crashing upon civilized shores, while the other suggests stone castles, feudal loyalties, and the intricate politics of the medieval world. The truth, as it so often is, lies not in the choice between the two, but in the astonishing fusion of them. It is the story of how a people of the sea became masters of the land, how the Norse fury was channeled, refined, and forged into a political and military weapon that would redraw the map of the known world. They are the ultimate paradox, pagan pirates who became defenders of the Christian faith, illiterate raiders who became patrons of grand monasteries, foreign invaders who became the quintessential kingdom builders of their age. Their story is a testament to an almost unparalleled capacity for adaptation, a relentless ambition that carried them from the foggy estuaries of northern France to the sun-drenched shores of Sicily and the contested Holy Lands of the Near East. We begin our journey where their name began, in the land of the Northmen, a place that was not conquered but given. I'm glad you're here, wishing you peace, rest, and maybe a little historical inspiration before sleep. Take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And as you settle in, feel free to post your location and what time it is where you are. It's always nice to know where fellow history lovers are tuning in from around the globe. Our story begins not with a crown or a castle, but with the rhythmic creak of oars and the sting of salt spray. For decades, the lands of the Franks had known the terror of the dragon-headed longships. The great empire forged by Charlemagne was crumbling, fractured by internal squabbles among his heirs, leaving its vast, river-veined territories vulnerable. These rivers, the lifeblood of Frankish commerce, became highways for Viking marauders. They were no longer simple smash-and-grab pirates. These were organized armies, wintering on Frankish soil, extorting massive payments of silver, the infamous Donegeld, and sacking cities with impunity. The city of Paris itself had endured a horrific siege in the 880s, its defenders watching helplessly as the Norsemen sailed past, their fleet so vast it was said to have taken days to pass a single point on the river Seine. This was the world that Charles, a king burdened with the rather unfortunate nickname, the Simple, inherited. His title in this case meant something more akin to straightforward or honest, but his political reality was anything but. He was a king with a grand title, King of West Francia, but his actual authority was a patchwork quilt of loyalties, constantly challenged by rival nobles and bled dry by the relentless Norse attacks. Into this chaotic landscape sailed a man whose own story is shrouded in the mists of saga and speculation. His name was Rollo. We don't know for certain if he was Danish or Norwegian. The chronicles are contradictory, a frustrating silence at the very origin point of our tale, representing one of those delightful historiographic mysteries where the truth is likely lost to time forever. What we do know is that he was a leader of immense stature, both literally and figuratively, a chieftain whose warband was too large, too successful, and too persistent to be ignored. By the early 10th century, Rollo wasn't just raiding the lands around the lower Seine. He was occupying them. He and his men had established a permanent, menacing presence centered around the city of Rouen. They were no longer ghosts who appeared with the tide and vanished again. They were a fixture, a Viking statelet growing like a parasite in the heart of Francia. For King Charles, Rollo was the embodiment of his kingdom's greatest problem. But within that problem, Charles, in a moment of shrewd desperation, glimpsed a solution. He couldn't defeat Rollo, and paying him to leave had proven to be only a temporary fix. So he decided to try something radical. He would invite the wolf into the sheepfold and ask him to guard the door. In the year 911, the two men met at a place called Saint-Clair-sur-Epte to formalize one of the most consequential deals of the Middle Ages. The terms were pragmatic to the point of genius. Charles would grant Rollo the lands his men already effectively controlled, a territory that would one day be known as Normandy, the land of the Northmen. In exchange, Rollo would have to do three things. First, he had to become a Christian and be baptized, a symbolic washing away of his pagan past. Second, he had to become the king's vassal, swearing an oath of loyalty. And third, and most crucially, he had to use his formidable Viking talents to defend the mouth of the Seine from all other Viking raiders. It was a brilliant piece of political outsourcing, turning the realm's most effective poacher into its most dedicated gamekeeper. The chronicles, written long after the fact, give us a story about the ceremony of homage that, while almost certainly untrue, reveals everything about the Norman character that would follow. As part of the ritual, a new vassal was expected to kiss the Lord's feet. Rollo, a man who had bowed to no one, flatly refused. The idea was anathema to him, an intolerable humiliation. The Frankish bishops, eager to conclude the treaty, urged him to comply. As a compromise, Rollo gruffly ordered one of his warriors to perform the act in his stead. The towering Norseman strode forward, but instead of kneeling, he seized the king's foot and, without bending his own back an inch, hoisted it straight up to his mouth. The unfortunate King Charles, a man already struggling for dignity, was unceremoniously tipped backward off his throne, much to the roaring laughter of the assembled Vikings. True or not, the legend perfectly captures the spirit of the Normans to be. They would accept the titles, the lands, and the religion of their new home, but they would do so on their own terms, with a fierce, unbending pride that bordered on insolence. Rollo was baptized, taking the Christian name Robert. He was now, in theory, a Frankish duke, but as he and his men settled into their new lands, the question remained whether the land would change the Northmen or if the Northmen would forever change the land. The ink on the treaty was barely dry, and the waters of baptism had only just settled upon Rollo's brow when the real work began. For a man and a people accustomed to taking what they wanted from the back of a ship, the challenge now was to hold and govern a land that was already home to a settled population of Gallo-Romans and Franks. The life of a raider is one of brutal simplicity, but the life of a duke is a thicket of complexity. Land needed to be distributed, laws needed to be enforced, and a new social order had to be imposed upon a resentful populace. Rollo, now Duke Robert, began parceling out estates to his chief lieutenants, transforming Viking captains into landed barons. In doing so, he was mimicking the feudal structures he saw around him in Francia, a system of reciprocal obligation where land was granted in exchange for military service. It was a foreign concept to these Northmen, whose loyalties were traditionally to a chieftain, not to the soil itself, but they were nothing if not pragmatic. They saw that this Frankish model was the key to controlling territory, and they adopted it with a swift and unsentimental efficiency. What followed in the subsequent decades is one of the most remarkable instances of cultural assimilation in European history. The Normans, as they were beginning to be called, underwent a profound transformation, shedding their ancestral identity with a speed that continues to puzzle historians. The most significant and mysterious change was linguistic. Within a single generation, the guttural sounds of Old Norse, the language of the sagas, and the sea kings began to fade from the fields and halls of Normandy. It was replaced almost entirely by the local Romance dialect, the precursor to Norman French. Why did the Norse language vanish so completely and so quickly? In other Viking colonies, like the Danelaw in England or the islands of Scotland, Norse dialects persisted for centuries. In Normandy, the language melted away like a spring frost. Perhaps the answer lay in the nature of the settlement. Rollo's men were an army, a military elite, not a mass migration of families. They took wives and concubines from the local Frankish population, and it was these women who raised the first generation of true Normans. These mothers spoke their native tongue to their children, embedding the French language deep within the family unit, making it the language of the home, not just the marketplace. The children of a Viking warrior and a Frankish noblewoman were something entirely new, looking at the world through Frankish eyes, but with a Norse fire still burning in their blood. This rapid cultural shift extended to religion and law. While Rollo's conversion was likely a matter of political convenience, the church wasted no time in cementing its influence. Monks, the great conduits of medieval culture, arrived to establish monasteries, which became centers of learning and administration. They brought with them Latin, the language of God and governance, further marginalizing the old pagan tongue. The worship of Odin and Thor, gods of the raid and the battle, had little place in a society now focused on agriculture, inheritance, and salvation. The old beliefs receded, becoming the stuff of folklore, while the Norman lords became vigorous, if sometimes brutally devout, patrons of the church, funding the construction of abbeys and cathedrals as monuments to their piety and their power. They adopted Frankish legal customs, blending them with their own Scandinavian traditions of justice, creating a unique legal framework for their new duchy. They were, in essence, running a social and cultural experiment, taking the most effective elements of the world they had invaded and grafting them onto their own formidable warrior ethos. This delicate and often violent process of fusion is perfectly embodied in the life of Rollo's son and successor, William, known as Longsword. William was the archetypal first-generation Norman, a man caught between two worlds. His mother, Papa of Bayeux, was a Frankish Christian noblewoman, and William was fluent in both his father's Norse and his mother's French. His reign was a constant, desperate balancing act. He faced a major rebellion from within his own duchy, led by Viking factions who felt he had become too soft, too Frankish, abandoning the old ways. At the same time, his powerful Frankish neighbors, like the Count of Flanders, viewed him with deep suspicion, seeing him not as a fellow Christian duke, but as the leader of a foreign warrior clan who could never truly be trusted. William fought to preserve his father's legacy, fostering ties with other Scandinavian rulers, while also playing the intricate game of Frankish politics, all in an effort to carve out a secure and respected place for his fledgling state. His life, however, ended in betrayal. In 942, he was ambushed and assassinated on the orders of the Count of Flanders, a stark reminder that the Normans were still seen as dangerous outsiders. Yet despite these setbacks, the core of the new Norman identity was being forged in the crucible of conflict. They had adopted the signature military technology of the Franks, the armored cavalryman. The Viking who fought on foot with a great axe was giving way to the Norman knight who charged into battle on a war horse wielding a lance. But they were not mere imitators. They took the Frankish concept of the cavalry charge and perfected it, infusing it with their inherent Norse discipline and ferocity. They fought as a cohesive unit, a wall of charging steel that was almost impossible to stop. They combined the tactical sophistication of the Franks with the sheer, relentless aggression of their Viking ancestors. They were becoming a new breed of warrior, speaking French, praying to a Christian god, and fighting on horseback, yet still animated by that restless, acquisitive, and profoundly ambitious spirit that had first driven their grandfathers across the sea. The raw northern metal was being hammered into a fine French blade, and it would soon be ready to carve out new kingdoms. The Norman blade, now tempered and sharp, needed a hand strong enough to wield it, and that hand would belong to a boy born under a cloud of scandal and violence. The ducal line, which had passed from the formidable Rollo to the unfortunate William Longsword, now rested with a man known to history as Robert the Magnificent. Robert was a true Norman, possessed of a restless energy that manifested as both extreme piety and brutal ambition. It was this man who, around the year 1028, cast his eyes upon a young woman from the town of Falaise named Herleva. The popular story, a piece of propaganda likely spread by his enemies, is that she was the daughter of a common tanner, a profession considered unclean, and that Duke Robert spotted her washing linens in a stream and was instantly captivated. He brought her to his castle, and from their union a son was born, William. To the wider world, and especially to the church, this union was unsanctioned, and its offspring was illegitimate, a bastard. But the historical reality, as is so often the case, might be more complex. Some historians suggest their relationship could have been a form of marriage, more Danico, or in the Danish manner, a kind of recognized long-term partnership inherited from their Norse ancestors, which was perfectly acceptable in their own culture, even if it lacked the church's blessing. Regardless of the legal or social technicalities, the stain of illegitimacy would cling to William for his entire life, a constant challenge to his authority. This vulnerability was cast into sharp relief when in 1034 his father Robert made a fateful decision. Gripped by a fit of religious fervor, he announced his intention to make a pilgrimage to the holy city of Jerusalem. His barons, well aware of the dangers of such a journey, begged him not to go. Who would rule? Who would keep the fiercely independent Norman lords in check? Robert, brushing aside their concerns, presented to them his only heir, his 6-year-old illegitimate son, William, and forced the grumbling magnates to swear an oath of fealty to the boy. With that, Robert the Magnificent walked away from his duchy, heading east toward salvation. He would never see Normandy again. He died in Nicaea on the journey home, and when the news finally trickled back, the duchy, which his sheer force of will had held together, exploded into chaos. The period that followed was known simply as the Anarchy. The oaths sworn to a child were forgotten overnight. The great Norman families, who had resented ducal authority, saw their chance to settle old scores, seize new lands, and carve out their own domains. For the young Duke William, life became a terrifying waking nightmare. He was the prize in a deadly game, a puppet duke whose legitimacy was the only thing stopping the complete dissolution of Normandy. His protectors, the men appointed by his father, were hunted down and eliminated one by one. His guardian, Gilbert of Brion, was murdered while out for a ride. His tutor, Durold, was captured and killed. Most terrifyingly of all, his steward, Osborne, was slaughtered in William's own bedchamber, his throat cut in the dead of night, while the young duke slept nearby. One can only imagine the psychological impact of such an upbringing. William learned in the cold and drafty castles of his youth that power was not a matter of title or right, but of strengths and survival. He was shuttled from the care of one loyal relative to another, constantly on the move, a fugitive in his own land, learning the bitter lessons of conspiracy, betrayal, and the absolute necessity of trusting no one. As he grew from a terrified boy into a hardened teenager, the chaos he had been born into began to forge him into a formidable man. He was tall, immensely strong, with a grim and brooding presence that promised violence. He was no longer a pawn to be protected, but a duke determined to claim his inheritance by force. In 1047, when William was around 19, the simmering rebellion finally boiled over. A powerful coalition of barons, led by his own cousin Guy of Burgundy and the powerful lords of western Normandy, rose in open revolt with the explicit aim of deposing and likely killing him, to be rid of the tanner's grandson once and for all. They saw this as their final opportunity to shatter the central power of the duchy. Facing overwhelming odds, William made a decision of audacious genius. He fled, riding not away from his enemies, but straight into the heart of the territory of his overlord and potential rival, King Henry the Pure of France. He appealed to the king not as a desperate boy, but as a fellow sovereign facing the problem that all rulers dreaded, treacherous vassals. King Henry, recognizing the truth in this, and seeing a chance to indebt the powerful Norman duke to him, agreed to an alliance. The two armies, the rebel Normans on one side, and the royal French army with Duke William's loyalists on the other, met on the fields of Valesdune. This was the moment William's entire life had been building toward. He was no longer hiding or running. He plunged into the thick of the battle, fighting with a cold fury that stunned both his allies and his enemies. The chroniclers tell of him unhorsing and nearly killing a prominent rebel lord with his own hands. He was proving, in the most visceral way possible, that he was his father's son, a warrior of unmatched prowess. The battle was a bloody, swirling melee of cavalry charges, and by the end of the day, the rebel army was broken, its remnants driven into the River Orne where many drowned. William was victorious. In the aftermath, he was utterly merciless, Rebel castles were torn down, lands were confiscated, and his enemies were exiled or executed. The anarchy was over, drowned in blood on the field of Val-les-Dunes. William, the boy who wasn't supposed to rule, had survived the long night. He was now, without question, the master of Normandy. With Normandy now beaten into submission and answering to a single, undisputed master, the restless energy that defined William's character began to search for a new, grander stage. For nearly 2 decades after his victory at Val-les-Dunes, he methodically consolidated his power, building castles, reforming the church, and creating one of the most centralized and formidable feudal states in Europe. But the ambition forged in the fires of his youth could not be contained within the borders of a single duchy. And so his gaze turned, as the gaze of ambitious men in northern Europe so often did, across the gray, churning waters of the English Channel to the ancient and wealthy kingdom of England. It was a land rich in silver, with a sophisticated system of governance and taxation that was the envy of the continent. It was a prize of immense value, and its throne, as fate would have it, was occupied by a man who inadvertently threw open the door to William's ambition. That man was Edward, known to history as the Confessor. Edward was a king of contradictions. He was famously, almost pathologically pious, more interested in prayer and church building than in the messy business of politics and war. But the most politically significant fact about him was that he was childless. After years of marriage to Edith, the daughter of the most powerful earl in the land, the royal bedchamber remained empty, leaving the future of the kingdom dangerously uncertain. Crucially, Edward had deep personal ties to Normandy. His mother was Emma of Normandy, the great aunt of Duke William himself, making Edward and William first cousins once removed. When the Danish king, Knut the Great, had conquered England, the young Edward was sent into exile for his own safety. He spent nearly 30 years, the formative decades of his life, growing up in the Norman court. He returned to England to claim his throne in 1042 as a middle-aged man who was, in his speech, his manners, and his friendships, more Norman than English. He surrounded himself with Norman advisors, Norman priests, and Norman favorites, granting them land and influence, much to the growing resentment of the proud Anglo-Saxon nobility. It was this Norman connection that formed the first thread in a tangled web of claims. According to the Norman chroniclers, and it is a tale told exclusively by them, Duke William paid a visit to his cousin Edward in England around the year 1051. During this visit, they claim, the childless Edward, grateful for the sanctuary Normandy had given him in his youth, and perhaps eager to spite the overbearing English nobles who dominated his court, formally promised the throne of England to William upon his death. This is one of history's great tantalizing mysteries. Did this promise ever really happen? Was it a firm political commitment, or was it perhaps a casual, friendly assurance between relatives that William's shrewd and legalistic mind later magnified into a binding contract? The English sources tellingly make no mention of it whatsoever. But for William, the truth of the matter was less important than its utility. A promise from a legitimate anointed king, however dubious, was a powerful piece of propaganda, a claim of right he could wield like a weapon. The second, and far stronger thread, was woven by the hands of the most powerful man in England, Harold Godwinson. Harold was the Earl of Wessex, a brilliant soldier, a charismatic politician, and the brother of King Edward's wife. As the aging king retreated further into his piety, Harold became the de facto ruler of the kingdom, its leading general and chief statesman. He was the natural successor, the choice of the English people and nobility. But in 1064, fate intervened in the most dramatic fashion. Harold set sail from the English coast on an unknown errand, perhaps a diplomatic mission, perhaps simply a pleasure cruise. A sudden, violent storm seized his ship, shattering its mast and driving it ashore on the coast of Ponthieu, a territory controlled by a notoriously greedy count who promptly took the valuable earl hostage. News of this prize catch soon reached Duke William, who immediately saw a golden opportunity. He paid the count a handsome ransom for his prestigious captive and had Harold brought to his own court in Rouen. Harold was no longer a prisoner in a dungeon, but he was now a guest in a gilded cage. William treated him with every courtesy, feasting him, taking him on military campaigns, even knighting him. But both men knew the reality of the situation. Harold could not leave until William allowed it. Before granting him his freedom, William staged a masterstroke of political theater. He asked Harold to swear a public, solemn oath of fealty to him. According to the Norman account, this was no mere oath of friendship. Harold was made to swear that he would act as William's agent in England, securing key fortresses, and most importantly, that he would support William's claim to the throne after Edward's death. With no other choice, Harold placed his hands on a covered table and spoke the words. And then came William's dramatic reveal. He had the cloth removed from the table, exposing a hidden chest filled with the most sacred relics he could find, bones of saints, fragments of the true cross. Harold, a deeply religious man, turned pale. He had not just sworn an oath to a duke, he had sworn it to God over the sanctified remains of his holiest martyrs. Bound by a dubious promise and now a sacred public oath, the succession of the English crown had become a trap, and it was about to be sprung. The fragile peace, held together only by the fading heartbeat of an old king, finally shattered in the bitter cold of January in 1066. In his palace at Westminster, Edward the Confessor lay dying. The great men of his kingdom gathered, their minds racing with the implications of what was to come. The succession, which had been a subject of whispers and foreign plots for years, was now a stark and immediate crisis. According to the English sources, in his final lucid moments, the pious king reached out to the man who had been the true pillar of his realm for years. Into Harold's hands, he is said to have murmured, "I commit my kingdom." For the Anglo-Saxon lords present, this deathbed pronouncement was all that mattered. It was the will of their dying king, and it superseded any vague, decade-old promise made to a foreign duke or any oath sworn under duress across the sea. There was no time for hesitation. Edward was buried the very next day in his newly consecrated masterpiece, Westminster Abbey. On that same day, Harold Godwinson was acclaimed as king by the Witan, the council of the realm, and crowned with all due haste. It was a swift, decisive political maneuver designed to present the world with a fact on the ground. England had a king, anointed and acclaimed. When the news of this lightning-fast coronation reached William in Rouen, it is said he was out hunting. He returned to his hall in a silent black fury, speaking to no one, his face a mask of thunder. In his mind, This was not a succession. It was a coup d'etat. It was a flagrant act of perjury, a sin not just against him, but against God himself. Harold, the man who had sworn on the holiest relics in Normandy to be his vassal, had placed the crown upon his own head. For William, the matter was no longer one of mere ambition. It was now a question of righteous vengeance. He had his casus belli, his legal and moral justification for war, and he would use it to rally a continent to his cause. As if the heavens themselves were weighing in on the unfolding drama, a terrifying omen appeared in the skies that spring. A brilliant, blazing star with a long, fiery tail hung in the night sky for weeks, an object we now know as Halley's Comet. To the deeply superstitious people of the 11th century, this was no natural phenomenon. It was a sign from the Almighty, a dreadful portent of plague, famine, and the fall of kings. In England, the comet was seen as a harbinger of doom for their new reign. The famous Bayeux tapestry depicts courtiers pointing up at it in terror, while a ghostly fleet of ships appears in the border below, foreshadowing the invasion to come. In Normandy, however, William's propagandists cleverly spun the celestial event as a sign of divine approval, a heavenly green light for his great enterprise. It was a sign that God was on his side in the coming struggle against the perjurer king. William now began to prepare for his great gamble, an undertaking of breathtaking scale and complexity. This was to be no mere raid, but a full-scale amphibious invasion, a logistical feat that few in the medieval world would have even dared to contemplate. An entire forest on the Norman coast was felled as shipwrights worked feverishly through the spring and summer, constructing a massive invasion fleet from scratch. Hundreds of flat-bottomed transports capable of carrying not just men, but the Normans' most vital weapon, their war horses. At the same time, he sent out a call to arms that echoed across Europe. He promised English land and titles to any lord or knight who would join his army. The response was overwhelming. Land-hungry younger sons, grizzled mercenaries, and ambitious adventurers flocked to his standard from Brittany, from Flanders, from central France, and beyond. He was assembling not just a Norman army, but a pan-European army of opportunists, all bound by the hope of immense wealth. But his greatest move was diplomatic. He dispatched an embassy to Rome to present his case to Pope Alexander II. He painted Harold as a sacrilegious oath-breaker and himself as the champion of the church, promising to reform an English church he claimed was corrupt and insular. The Pope, seeing a chance to assert papal authority over the independent-minded English church, sided with William. He declared the invasions a holy war and sent William a consecrated papal banner to fly at the head of his army. All through the summer of 1066, William's massive army and fleet lay waiting on the Norman coast, a coiled spring of latent violence. But the winds, stubbornly and maddeningly, blew from the north, making a channel crossing impossible. Weeks turned into a month, then two, and William had to use all of his formidable will to hold his restless, expensive army together. Meanwhile, in England, King Harold had assembled his own forces on the south coast, staring out at the empty sea, waiting for an invasion that refused to come. As summer faded into autumn, Harold's army, composed largely of militia who needed to return home for the harvest, began to disband. And at that exact moment of vulnerability, Harold's worst nightmare came true. A second threat, long feared, materialized from a different direction. In the north, a vast Viking fleet under the command of the most feared warrior of the age, King Harald Hardrada of Norway, the Thunderbolt of the North, had landed. Hardrada was allied with Harold Godwinson's own, estranged and vengeful brother, Tostig. The storm had broken not from the south, but from the north. The English king now faced two full-scale invasions, and he had to march his exhausted army 200 miles to confront the first, knowing that by doing so, he was leaving the southern coast of England terrifyingly exposed. King Harold, a man forged in the crucible of English politics and warfare, did not hesitate. Receiving the news of the Viking landing in the north, he gathered his housecarls, the elite professional warriors who formed the core of his army, and any local militia he could muster, and began a grueling, relentless forced march up the great Roman road that ran the length of his kingdom. He covered the nearly 200 miles from London to York in a staggering 4 days, a feat of speed and endurance that utterly stunned the Norse invaders. On the 25th of September, he fell upon the unsuspecting army of Harald Hardrada and his own brother Tostig at a place called Stamford Bridge. The Vikings, caught completely by surprise, many of them without their mailcoats in the autumn heat, were slaughtered. The battle was a saga in its own right, a day of primeval butchery. Hardrada, the great Viking king, a giant of a man, was struck in the throat by an arrow and fell. Tostig, the traitor brother, was cut down soon after. The Viking army, one of the last great pagan hosts, was annihilated, ending 2 centuries of Scandinavian terror in England. Of the 300 ships that had brought the invaders, a mere 24 were needed to carry the survivors home. Harold Godwinson had won a magnificent, crushing victory. As Harold stood on the bloody field of Stamford Bridge, savoring a triumph that should have secured his throne for a generation, the winds in the English Channel, which had protected him for so long, finally changed. Back in Normandy, William, whose army was on the verge of disintegrating from the long, anxious wait, seized his moment. On the night of September 27th, under the light of a full moon, the great invasion fleet set sail. Hundreds of ships, packed with thousands of nervous soldiers and their whinnying, terrified horses, moved silently across the dark water. They landed the next morning at Pevensey Bay in Sussex, completely unopposed. The south coast, stripped of its defenders, was wide open. The Norman army disembarked with practiced efficiency, securing a beachhead and building prefabricated wooden castles they had brought with them in sections, a testament to their logistical foresight. William now faced a strategic choice. He could march on London, but that would risk stretching his supply lines and being trapped deep in enemy territory. Instead, he chose a more brutal and cunning strategy. He was in the heart of Harold's own personal earldom of Wessex. He unleashed his army upon the surrounding countryside, burning villages, slaughtering livestock, and terrorizing the local population. It was not wanton destruction. It was a calculated provocation, a personal insult designed to sting Harold's pride and force the English king to come to him, to fight on ground of William's choosing. The news of the Norman landing reached Harold as he was still in York, tending to the wounded and celebrating his victory. The elation of his triumph had turned instantly to the cold dread of a new, even greater crisis. His greatest victory and his greatest challenge had arrived within the same week. His advisors, including his own wisest brother Kjurth, begged him to be cautious. His army was battered, exhausted, and depleted from the savage fighting at Stamford Bridge. They urged him to wait in London, to gather fresh levies from across the kingdom, and to let William's army exhaust its own supplies, while Gurth himself led the existing army to harry the Normans. It was sound, sensible advice, but Harold, perhaps overconfident after his spectacular success in the north, perhaps infuriated by the news that William was laying waste to the lands and people he was sworn to protect, made a fateful decision. He would not wait. He would march south immediately and crush this second invasion just as he had crushed the first. And so began a second legendary forced march. The victors of Stamford Bridge, weary to their bones, turned around and retraced their steps, covering another 250 miles in little over a week. They arrived in London around the 6th of October, gathering what few reinforcements they could before marching out a few days later to confront the Norman host. It was a terrible gamble, driven by pride and a warrior's instinct, and it remains one of the great what-ifs of history. What if he had waited? But Harold chose his ground carefully. On the 13th of October, his army arrived and took up a superb defensive position on a ridge known as Senlac Hill, about 7 miles from Hastings, straddling the main road from the coast. He had the high ground, his flanks protected by steep slopes and woods. His plan was simple and proven. He would form his men into an unbreakable shield wall, a dense formation of warriors, shoulder to shoulder, their round shields interlocked, presenting a fearsome barrier of wood, leather, and steel. The Normans would have to charge uphill into a hailstorm of axes and spears and break themselves upon that wall. As night fell, the two armies made their camps in sight of one another. The English, boisterous and confident, spent the night drinking ale and singing songs around their campfires. The Normans, in stark contrast, spent a somber night in prayer and contemplation, their priests moving among the tents, hearing confessions and offering absolution. The fate of England would be decided by the dawn. The dawn of October 15th, 1066, rose over a scene of carnage. The great English shield wall was broken, its defenders scattered or slain. King Harold, the last Anglo-Saxon king of England, lay dead upon the field alongside his loyal brothers, his body so horrifically mutilated that it could only be identified, according to legend, by his grief-stricken wife. But William's victory at Hastings, as total as it was, did not win him a kingdom. It had merely decapitated its leadership. The conquest of England had only just begun. Believing the country would now submit, William waited for the surviving English lords to come to him and offer him the crown. When they did not, he began a slow, deliberate, and terrifying march not directly on London, but around it, in a great tightening arc of fire and steel. He subdued the southern ports, brutally sacking towns that offered resistance, before swinging north to cross the Thames and descend upon the capital from the other side. The message was clear. There would be no escape. Finally, at Berkhamsted, the remaining English magnates, including the young Edgar Atheling, the last scion of the old royal house, lost their nerve. They came out and submitted to the Norman duke, offering him the crown they no longer had the strength to defend. On Christmas Day of 1066, William was crowned King of England in Edward the Confessor's new abbey at Westminster. The ceremony was a tense affair, a perfect microcosm of the violent cultural collision that was the Norman Conquest. The Archbishop of York asked the assembled English nobles, in Old English, if they accepted William as their king, and they roared their acclamation. The Bishop of Coutances then asked the Normans the same question in French, and they too shouted their assent. The Norman guards stationed outside the abbey, hearing the unfamiliar guttural shouts of the English and understanding nothing, immediately assumed a riot had broken out, that their duke was being betrayed. Following their brutal instincts, they set fire to the surrounding houses. The abbey filled with smoke, and the panicked congregation fled into the street, leaving William and a few trembling priests to complete the sacred coronation rites amidst the chaos and the crackle of burning homes. William was now the anointed King of England, but he had been crowned to the sound of his new subjects screaming in terror. In the first year of his reign, William attempted a degree of reconciliation, confirming some English lords in their lands and taking others with him back to Normandy as honored guests who were, in reality, hostages. But England was a proud and ancient kingdom, and it would not be subdued so easily. The country began to smolder with rebellion. Resistance flared up first in the West Country, then in the marshes of the fens, and most ominously in the vast, fiercely independent lands of the North. William, now the Conqueror in name as well as deed, responded with lightning speed and overwhelming force. He crisscrossed his new kingdom, stamping out these fires one by one. With each crushed rebellion, more English land was declared forfeit. A vast and total dispossession of the native aristocracy began as William carved up the shires of England and granted them as fiefs to his Norman, French, and Flemish followers, the men who had gambled everything to follow him across the sea. The English landscape began to change as hundreds of Motte and Bailey castles, alien structures of earth and timber, were thrown up to dominate the surrounding countryside, constant visible reminders of the new military occupation. The gravest challenge to his rule came in 1069 from the north. The north of England had always been a world apart, a land of deep Anglo-Scandinavian heritage that had never been fully integrated by the southern kings. A rebellion erupted, centered on the great city of York, and the rebels were soon joined by a massive Danish fleet sent by King Sweyn of Denmark, who saw an opportunity to press his own claim to the English throne. The Norman garrison in York was overwhelmed and slaughtered to a man. For a moment, it seemed as if the conquest itself might be reversed. William's response was one of terrible, calculated fury. He marched his army north in the dead of winter. His first move was characteristically pragmatic. He paid the Danish fleet a vast sum of silver to simply sail away and abandon their English allies. Then, with the rebels isolated, he unleashed an act of state terror so brutal it shocked even his own chroniclers. It has become known to history as the harrying of the North. This was not a war against an army. It was a war against the land itself and the people who lived on it. Over the winter of 1069 to 1070, William's armies moved methodically through the shires of Yorkshire and beyond, executing a scorched earth policy of unimaginable devastation. They burned villages, farms, and granaries. They destroyed tools and slaughtered livestock. They systematically eliminated every source of food, every means of survival. The goal was not merely to punish the rebels, but to destroy the region's capacity to ever support another uprising. The chronicles of the time, even those written by Normans, speak of the horror that followed. A terrible famine that stalked the land for years, of families selling their own children into slavery for a scrap of food, of desperate, starving people resorting to cannibalism, and of roadsides littered with the unburied dead. The once proud North was reduced to a depopulated, smoking wasteland. When William's surveyors compiled his great Domesday Book 17 years later, vast swathes of the North were still recorded with the single, chilling Latin word, vasta, waste. William had secured his kingdom, but he had done so with an iron fist, leaving a scar on the landscape and the memory of England that would never truly fade. With the smoke still rising from the ruins of the North and the last embers of English resistance brutally extinguished, the Norman Conquest entered a new and arguably more profound phase. The period of open warfare and rebellion was largely over. What followed was the slow, methodical, and relentless imposition of a new order upon the kingdom, a transformation of its laws, its landscape, and its very social structure. The first and most visible instrument of this new order was the castle. The hastily built earth and timber forts of the initial invasion were systematically replaced with imposing structures of stone. All across England, great square keeps began to rise, dominating the skylines of towns and the strategic river crossings. The most famous of these, the White Tower in London, was a stark, menacing declaration of intent, a fortress built not just to defend the city, but to intimidate its populace. For the English people, these castles were a daily, inescapable reminder of their subjugation, the physical embodiment of a new and alien power that was there to stay. Behind the security of these stone walls, William oversaw the single greatest transfer of land and wealth in English history. By right of conquest, he declared that every acre of land in England belonged to him personally. He was now the sole and universal landlord. He then proceeded to grant vast estates to the roughly 200 great Norman barons who had fought for him, his tenants-in-chief. In one stroke, the ancient Anglo-Saxon aristocracy was almost entirely wiped out, replaced by a French-speaking military elite. But this was not a simple giveaway. The land was granted under a new set of rules, a rigid system of continental feudalism that was far more centralized than anything England had known before. In return for their land, his barons had to swear a binding oath of personal loyalty, and most critically, provide a specified number of trained, armored knights for the king's army. These great barons then subdivided their own lands, granting manors to lesser knights and vassals in exchange for their direct military service. It was a pyramid of power, with every landowner, from the mightiest earl to the humblest knight, bound by a chain of obligation that led directly back to one man, the king. Power, land, and military service were now inextricably linked, creating a formidable and efficient machine for royal control. For nearly 2 decades, this new system settled into place. Then, in the cold winter of 1085, William, now an aging and corpulent ruler, faced a new crisis. He was threatened by a potential invasion from the King of Denmark, who still harbored ambitions for the English throne, and he needed to raise a massive army and levy a heavy tax to pay for it. At a Christmas court held in Gloucester, he made a momentous decision. He would conduct a full and comprehensive survey of his entire kingdom. He wanted to know, with exacting precision, exactly what he now ruled. He wanted a definitive record of who held which lands, how much they were worth, what resources they contained, and how much tax they could bear. It was an administrative undertaking of breathtaking ambition, a nationwide audit on a scale that no medieval European ruler had ever attempted before. The process itself was a marvel of Norman efficiency. The kingdom was divided into circuits, and teams of royal commissioners, or legates, were dispatched to every shire. They held great public inquiries at the local courts, putting sworn juries of local men, half Norman, half English, under oath to answer a long and detailed list of questions. The inquiries were forensic in their detail. For every single manor in the kingdom, the commissioners asked, who held this land in the time of King Edward? Who holds it now? How many hides, a measure of taxable land, are there? How many plow teams are at work? How many mills and fisheries? How many villagers, smallholders, and tellingly slaves? And the crucial question for the royal treasury: what was it worth before 1066, and what is it worth now? The sheer intrusive thoroughness of the investigation stunned the English populace. One chronicler at Peterborough wrote with a mixture of awe and resentment. So very narrowly did he have it investigated that there was no single hide, nor a yard of land, nor indeed one ox, nor one cow, nor one pig which was left out and not put down in his record. The vast mountains of data were sent back to the Royal Scriptorium at Winchester, where they were edited, abbreviated into a dense coded Latin, and compiled into 2 enormous volumes. The result was a document unlike any other from the Middle Ages. The English people, subjected to this relentless and inescapable inventory, gave it a popular and enduring nickname, the Domesday Book. For them, its judgments on their property and taxes were as final and irreversible as those of the Day of Judgment, or Doomsday. While historians still debate its primary purpose, was it for taxation, military planning, or legal settlement, it was undoubtedly a masterstroke of governance. It provided William with an unparalleled understanding of his new kingdom's wealth and structure. But more than that, it was the ultimate statement of his power. It was the final seal on the conquest, a definitive ledger of the new Norman order, written with the scratch of a scribe's quill, but backed by the unassailable power of the sword. The Norman conquest of England was not waged with swords and castles alone. Once the physical subjugation was complete, a quieter, more insidious conquest began, the conquest of language. The imposition of the new Norman order created a linguistic chasm that would define English society for 300 years. Overnight, England became a fractured, trilingual nation. At the top of the pyramid, the new Norman elite, the king, his court, his barons, his knights, and high-ranking clergy, all spoke Norman French. This was the language of power, prestige, law, and culture. In the middle, the ancient language of learning and of the church, Latin, continued to be used for official records and theological works. William's great Domesday Book was written not in French or English, but in the universal Latin of administration, and at the bottom, spoken by over 95% of the population, was Old English. The rich, complex, and ancient language of the Anglo-Saxons, the language of Beowulf and the great chronicles, was now the tongue of the conquered, the voiceless, the peasantry. What followed was not an official policy to eradicate the English language. The Normans were too pragmatic for such things. Instead, English was simply demoted, starved of prestige until it withered as a language of high culture. With the entire native aristocracy dead or dispossessed, there was no one left to patronize English poets or scribes. The great monastic scriptoriums, which had been vibrant centers for the copying and creation of English manuscripts, either fell silent or turned their efforts to producing works in the Latin and French favored by their new Norman patrons. For the first time in centuries, the language of the English people was almost completely unwritten. It became a purely oral tongue, the language of the field, the village, and the marketplace, but not of the court, the castle, or the document. To the French-speaking lords, English was a guttural, rustic babble, the crude speech of their laborers, a peasant's patois. A deep and lasting snobbery was established. To be powerful was to speak French. To speak English was to be a Creole, a nobody. This linguistic hierarchy is fossilized in the very words we use today, particularly in the vocabulary of food. The Anglo-Saxon peasant, out in the mud and the rain, tended to the living animals, and so their Old English names survive: the cow, the swine, the sheep, the deer. But the Norman lord, sitting at his great trestle table in his stone-walled hall, ate the cooked meat, and so we use the French words for it: beef, from boeuf, pork, from pork, mutton, from mouton, and venison, from venison. This simple distinction paints a perfect, almost poignant picture of the social order. The English raise it, the Normans eat it. This pattern repeats itself across every domain of life associated with power and sophistication. The very machinery of the new state was described in French. Words like government, parliament, crown, state, empire, realm, authority, and sovereign are all Norman imports. The legal system was entirely theirs: justice, judge, jury, court, verdict, prison, sentence, accuse, acquit. The language of war became French: army, navy, battle, siege, combat, soldier, captain, officer. Even the concepts of high culture, art, music, dance, fashion, cuisine, poetry, romance, arrived with the Normans, pushing aside their Old English equivalents. For generations, this linguistic apartheid defined daily life. The lord of the manor could not speak to the villagers who worked his fields without an interpreter. The judge in his court could not understand the testimony of the English peasant standing before him. It created a profound sense of alienation, a kingdom where the rulers and the ruled literally did not speak the same language. We can only guess at how quickly the new Norman landholders, particularly the lesser knights living on rural manors, learned the basics of English out of sheer necessity, but in the high circles of power, French remained the dominant tongue for centuries. Yet this separation could not last forever. Through daily contact, through trade, and eventually through intermarriage, the two languages began to bleed into one another. Slowly, tentatively, English began its long climb back to respectability. But when it re-emerged as a written language in the centuries after the conquest, it was a profoundly changed beast. It was a language that had lost most of its complex Germanic inflections, but had gained an immense and glittering new treasury of French vocabulary. The muscular, earthy foundation of Anglo-Saxon had been fused with the sophisticated, abstract lexicon of Norman French. The Norman attempt to supplant English had failed, but in that failure, they had inadvertently forged something new, the uniquely rich, flexible, and expansive language that would one day become modern English, a tongue with a Germanic body and a Romance soul. William, the Conqueror, the man who had bent a kingdom to his will, surveyed his domains in his later years with a satisfaction tempered by a deep and abiding weariness. He had achieved everything he had set out to do. He was the undisputed master of both his ancestral Normandy and his conquered England, a dual realm held together by the sheer force of his personality. Yet the man who had won the great prize found that it brought him little peace. His final years were not a quiet autumn of kingship, but a bitter season of personal strife and family betrayal. The lean, powerful warrior of Hastings had grown enormously overweight, a corpulent figure who still possessed the same terrifying temper and unbending will. His greatest challenges, however, came not from rebellious subjects or foreign kings, but from within the walls of his own household, from the sons born of his own body. He had 3 sons who survived to adulthood: Robert, the eldest, William Rufus, the second son, and Henry, the youngest. The succession was a constant source of tension. Robert, nicknamed Curthose for his short, stocky build, was the designated heir to the ancestral duchy of Normandy. He was a brave and capable warrior in his own right, but he was also indolent, profligate with money, and easily swayed by a coterie of discontented young nobles. He chafed under his father's iron-fisted rule, demanding to be given real power in Normandy immediately, not as a future promise. William, a man who had never shared power with anyone, saw this not as youthful ambition, but as insolence and weakness, and he refused. The second son, William Rufus, was his father's favorite, a gruff, ruthless, and effective soldier, very much in the conqueror's mold. It was an open secret that he was intended to inherit the great prize, the kingdom of England. The youngest, Henry, was given a vast sum of silver, but no land. A clever and scholarly boy, left to bide his time and use his intellect to navigate the brutal politics of his family. The simmering resentment between father and eldest son boiled over into open rebellion thanks to a petty, humiliating incident. While William and his court were staying at a castle in Normandy, the 2 younger sons, William Rufus and Henry, as a boorish prank, emptied a full chamber pot from an upper balcony onto the head of their elder brother Robert as he passed below. Robert, drenched in filth and public humiliation, exploded in a rage. He drew his sword, intent on avenging his honor against his brothers, and their father, the king, had to personally intervene to stop them from killing each other. For Robert, this was the final straw. He saw the prank not just as a brotherly squabble, but as a sign of his complete lack of respect within the family and at court. That night, he and his followers fled and launched a full-scale rebellion against his father. For years, Robert waged a bitter guerrilla war against the conqueror, finding ready allies in his father's many enemies, including the King of France. The conflict reached a dramatic and almost tragic climax at a battle in 1079. In the chaos of a cavalry charge, Robert came face to face with a large, heavily armored knight. He charged, leveled his lance, and struck the knight squarely, knocking him from his horse. As he moved in to finish his opponent, the wounded man cried out. It was the voice of his father, King William. In a moment of horror, Robert recognized him. He immediately dismounted, helped the wounded king back onto a horse, and allowed him to escape the field, but the damage was done. William, humiliated at being unhorsed by his own son, never truly forgave him. The wound to his pride was far deeper than the wound to his leg. William's own end came 8 years later, in 1087. While leading a punitive campaign against the French king, he sacked and burned the town of Mantes. As he rode through the smoldering ruins, his horse shied, rearing suddenly. The massively overweight king was thrown forward violently against the high pommel of his saddle, suffering a grievous internal injury, likely a ruptured intestine. Mortally wounded, he was carried to a priory in Rouen, where he lingered in agony for weeks. On his deathbed, he is said to have repented for the great sins of his life, confessing his regret for the bloodshed of his conquest, and in particular, the terrible cruelty of the harrying of the North. He divided his empire, granting Normandy to the rebellious Robert, and bequeathing England to his favorite, William Rufus. Then the great conqueror died. What followed was a scene of utter chaos that spoke volumes about the nature of his rule. The moment he breathed his last, his terrified attendants, high and low, stripped his body of everything valuable, rings, clothes, even the bed sheets, and fled, leaving their king's naked corpse lying on the floor. His body was eventually transported to his own great abbey in Caen for burial, but the indignities were not over. The funeral service was interrupted by a local man who loudly claimed that William had stolen the very land upon which the church was built from his family, and he demanded justice. The embarrassed bishops had to negotiate a settlement and pay the man off on the spot before they could proceed. Then came the final, grotesque horror. The king's body had bloated in the summer heat, and the stone sarcophagus prepared for him was now too small. As the attendants struggled to force the swollen corpse into the narrow tomb, the abdomen ruptured. An overwhelming, abominable stench of decay filled the church, sending the mourners reeling and choking as they fled for the fresh air. It was a squalid, farcical, and profoundly undignified end for the man who had conquered a kingdom and changed the course of history forever. While the sons of William the Conqueror schemed and fought over their father's inheritance, squabbling for control of the kingdoms he had forged, an entirely different Norman story was unfolding hundreds of miles to the south, under a sun far hotter than the pale light of Normandy or England. This was not a story of a grand, centralized conquest led by a duke, but a sprawling, chaotic, and altogether more entrepreneurial tale of individual ambition. It was the story of how small bands of land-hungry knights, younger sons with no inheritance to look forward to at home, traveled to a land of opportunity and through sheer audacity and military prowess conquered a kingdom for themselves. Our narrative now leaves the damp green fields of northern Europe and travels down the long spine of Italy to the vibrant, violent, and politically fractured world of the Mediterranean. The south of Italy, the region known as the Mezzogiorno, was at the dawn of the 11th century a dizzying mosaic of competing powers and cultures. It was a land of ancient cities, sun-scorched hills, and strategic harbors, a crossroads where the great civilizations of the age collided. The Byzantine Empire, the last remnant of ancient Rome, clung precariously to the heel and toe of the Italian peninsula, their authority constantly challenged by internal revolts and external threats. In the center, a handful of petty Lombard principalities, the descendants of an earlier Germanic invasion, bickered and warred amongst themselves, their rulers bearing grand titles but commanding little real power. Along the glittering coastline, wealthy merchant republics like Amalfi and Naples paid lip service to Byzantine authority but functioned as fiercely independent city-states. And looming over all of them from the south was the power of the Saracens, the Arab Muslims who controlled the wealthy island of Sicily and launched frequent devastating raids on the Italian mainland. Into this political hornet's nest, a place of constant, low-grade warfare where loyalty was a commodity and armies were always for hire, rode the first Normans. The story of their arrival is shrouded in the mist of pious legend, a tale perhaps polished by later chroniclers to cast a nobler sheen on what was essentially a mercenary enterprise. The tale goes that in the year 999, a band of some 40 Norman pilgrims, returning from a journey to the Holy Sepulchre in Jerusalem, stopped at the Lombard port of Salerno. As they were enjoying the city's hospitality, a Saracen fleet sailed into the harbor, demanding the payment of a hefty annual tribute. The Normans watched in disgust as the Lombards dithered, preparing to pay the humiliating extortion. Seizing the initiative, the travel-worn but battle-ready pilgrims demanded weapons and horses from the local prince, Guaimar III. Armed and mounted, they led a ferocious charge against the Saracen landing party, fighting with such disciplined fury that the raiders were driven back to their ships in panicked confusion. The grateful Prince Guaimar showered the pilgrims with gifts and begged them to stay, offering immense rewards if they would encourage more of their formidable countrymen to come south and enter his service. Whether the story of the pilgrims is literally true or not, it captures the essence of what happened next. Word of the South began to filter back to Normandy, tales of a warm land, rich in olives and wine, where a skilled man with a strong sword arm could win himself a fortune. For the crowded class of minor Norman nobility, this was an irresistible lure. The system of primogeniture, where the eldest son inherited the entirety of the family's estate, meant that Normandy was teeming with ambitious, well-trained, and landless younger sons. Their prospects at home were bleak: a life in the church, or a life as a landless dependent in their elder brother's household. The Mezzogiorno offered a thrilling alternative, and so they came. They arrived not as a unified army, but in small, independent bands of knights, sometimes no more than a dozen, drawn by the scent of gold and glory. They were soldiers of fortune in the purest sense, selling their services to the highest bidder. They would fight for a Lombard prince against the Byzantines one season, and for a Byzantine governor against a Lombard prince the next. They fought for rebel leaders, for powerful abbots, for anyone who could meet their price. Their only loyalty was to the captain of their small company, and their only ideology was self-advancement. For the first few decades, they remained a volatile but manageable element in the complex southern Italian power struggle. But that began to change with the arrival of one particular family, a family of astonishing ambition and ruthless talent that would come to dominate the age. In the Cotentin Peninsula of Normandy lived a minor land-poor baron named Tancred de Hauteville. He was a man of little wealth, but he had one notable asset: 12 sons. With no land to give them, he gave them a warrior's education and his blessing to seek their fortunes abroad. One by one, the elder sons, men like William, nicknamed Iron Arm for his incredible strength, and his brother Drogo, made the long journey south. They were tougher, cannier, and more cohesive than the mercenary bands that had preceded them. They quickly distinguished themselves, rising from simple soldiers for hire to commanders and lords in their own right. They were the vanguard of a new phase in the Norman adventure. They were no longer content to merely serve the lords of this new land. Soon, they would conspire to become its masters. Among the 12 sons of the obscure Norman baron Tancred de Hauteville, one name would come to eclipse all the others, a name that would be spoken with fear and awe from the courts of Germany to the golden palaces of Constantinople. That name was Robert. He was a younger son from Tancred's second marriage, and when he arrived in southern Italy around the year 1047, his more established elder half-brothers, William Ironarm and Drogo, saw him less as a welcome reinforcement and more as another mouth to feed, a potential rival for the lands they had already won. He was tall, fair-haired, and possessed of a booming voice and a formidable presence, but he arrived with almost nothing. His brothers, eager to keep him at a distance, gave him the most miserable command they could find: a tiny, malarial garrison in the rugged, untamed mountains of Calabria, the very toe of the Italian boot. It was a land of swamps, forests, and rebellious Byzantine Greeks, a place meant to contain his inhibition, or perhaps even to end it. For any other man, it might have been a dead end. For Robert, it was an opportunity. It was here, in the harsh and unforgiving landscape of Calabria, that he began to earn the nickname that would define him: Guiscard, a Norman French word that translates roughly as the cunning, the wily, or even the weasel. He was too poor and his warband too small to wage conventional war, so he became a master of unconventional tactics. He was, in these early years, little more than a bandit chief, a robber baron of extraordinary talent. He lived by raiding, extortion, and cattle rustling, preying on Byzantine towns and Lombard travelers alike. The stories of his cunning became legendary. In one famous tale, he sought to capture a fortified monastery that was too strong to be taken by direct assault, so he devised a brilliant piece of psychological warfare. He sent a message to the monks, informing them that one of his bravest young knights had died and that his last wish was to be buried in the monastery's hallowed ground, a request accompanied by a generous donation. The monks, seeing an opportunity for both a pious act and a tidy profit, agreed. A solemn funeral procession arrived at the gates, carrying a coffin. Once inside the walls, however, the corpse suddenly sprang to life, sword in hand. The knight was not dead, and the coffin was full of weapons. The Normans seized the monastery from within, and Robert had a new, well-stocked fortress. This was the essence of the Guiscard, a man who saw every situation as a puzzle to be solved, using guile and ruthlessness where brute force would not suffice. Through such methods, Robert's power, wealth, and reputation grew. He attracted a loyal following of other landless Normans who were drawn to his charisma and his promise of plunder. Meanwhile, the initial Norman leadership began to falter. William Ironarm died of a fever. His brother and successor, Drogo, was assassinated in his own chapel, a victim of a conspiracy among his Lombard subjects. A power vacuum opened at the top of the Norman hierarchy, and Robert, the once marginalized upstart, was perfectly positioned to fill it. In 1057, the Norman counts, recognizing his unmatched cunning and military success, elected him as their new leader, granting him the title of Count of Apulia. The bandit from Calabria was now the master of all the Normans in Italy. With this new authority, his ambition exploded. He was no longer content with mere raiding. He now sought to build a state. He began a systematic campaign of conquest, targeting the last remaining Byzantine strongholds in southern Italy. He was a brilliant general, combining the ferocious, unstoppable charge of the Norman heavy cavalry with a patient mastery of siege warfare and a cynical appreciation for diplomacy and bribery. One by one, the great cities of the south fell to him, their ancient walls proving no match for his persistence and tactical flexibility. His rising power, however, created a new and formidable enemy. In Rome, Pope Leo IX watched the growth of this Norman state on his southern border with increasing alarm. He saw these Normans not as pious pilgrims, but as a horde of savage freebooters, a cancer on the Italian peninsula. Determined to destroy them, the Pope assembled a massive coalition army of disgruntled Lombards and elite German knights sent by the Holy Roman Emperor, and marched south in 1053 to exterminate the Guicard and his followers. The two armies met at the Battle of Civitate. The Normans were catastrophically outnumbered, a few thousand against a vast papal host. But they were united, desperate, and led by a military genius. In a stunning display of tactical brilliance, Robert Guiscard and his Normans smashed the larger papal army, annihilated the elite German contingent, and in their greatest triumph, captured the Pope himself. Here, Robert's cunning reached its zenith. Instead of mistreating or executing his holy captive, which would have brought the wrath of all Christendom down upon him, he did the opposite. He fell to his knees before Leo IX, begged for his forgiveness as a sinner, and treated him with the utmost reverence, personally escorting him back toward Rome. This masterful act of political theater turned his greatest enemy into his most powerful asset. The papacy, forced to recognize the reality of Norman power, performed a stunning reversal. A few years later, Pope Nicholas II formed a formal alliance with Robert Guiscard. In the Treaty of Melfi in 1059, the Pope officially legitimized all of Robert's past and future conquests. The man who had arrived in Italy as a penniless adventurer was now Robert, by the grace of God, and Saint Peter, Duke of Apulia and Calabria, and future Duke of Sicily. The robber baron had become a sovereign prince, his conquests sanctioned by the very man he had defeated and captured in battle. Robert Guiscard's audacious bargain with the papacy had not only legitimized his conquests on the Italian mainland, it had also given him a divine mandate for his next, even more ambitious, enterprise. The title granted to him, Duke of Apulia and Calabria, and future Duke of Sicily, was a papal blessing for an invasion, a holy green light to cross the narrow strait of Messina and reclaim the wealthy island of Sicily for Christendom. But the Guiscard, a man whose genius lay in both strategy and the judgment of character, knew he could not undertake such a monumental task alone. For this new chapter in the Norman saga, a new hero was required, a man who possessed the family's trademark ambition and ruthlessness, but who also had a charisma and frontline brilliance all his own. This was the moment for the youngest, and perhaps the most gifted, of Tancred de Hauteville's 12 sons, Roger. Roger, later known as Roger Basso, arrived in Italy in 1057, a young man in his late 20s, handsome, charming, and a warrior of prodigious talent. He arrived to find his brother Robert already the master of the Normans, and the initial relationship between the two was fraught with the familiar de Hauteville blend of family loyalty and intense sibling rivalry. Robert, wary of this brilliant and popular younger brother, gave him the same harsh apprenticeship he himself had endured, granting him a poor and dangerous command in the untamed hills of Calabria. For a time, Roger lived the life of a freebooter, his tiny warband so impoverished that he and his men were sometimes forced to resort to horse thieving to make ends meet. But his skill was too great to be ignored. He pacified his corner of Calabria with an efficiency that impressed even the Guiscard. Robert soon realized that his youngest brother was far more valuable as a partner than as a rival, and the two forged a powerful alliance, agreeing to share control of the south. This partnership would go on to conquer a kingdom. The island of Sicily, shimmering just a few miles across the water, was a prize of immense value. For over 2 centuries, it had been under Muslim rule, and it had become a center of Mediterranean trade and a jewel of Islamic civilization. Its great cities, like the capital Palermo, were home to magnificent mosques, bustling markets, and elaborate gardens fed by ingenious irrigation systems. But this prosperous facade concealed a fatal political weakness. The ruling Kalbid dynasty had collapsed, and the island had fractured into a state of civil war, with 3 rival emirs vying for control. It was this internal division that provided the Normans with their opportunity. In 1061, one of these emirs, Ibn al-Thimna of Syracuse, finding himself on the losing side of the conflict, made a fateful decision. He crossed the strait and formally invited the fearsome Norman brothers to intervene, offering to become their vassal and grant them a permanent foothold on the island in exchange for their help in defeating his rivals. For Robert and Roger, it was the invitation they had been waiting for. Acting with stunning speed, they gathered a small elite force and crossed the Strait of Messina under the cover of darkness. They stormed and captured the vital port city of Messina, a strategic masterpiece that gave them control of the gateway to the island. But this initial, spectacular success was deceptive. The conquest of Sicily would not be a swift affair like the conquest of England, decided in a single day of battle. It was to be a long, grueling, hard-fought war of attrition that would consume the next 30 years. The Muslim population was large, the terrain was difficult, and the island's many fortified towns and cities were fiercely defended. Robert Guiscard, his attention often diverted by rebellions on the mainland, and his even grander dream of conquering the Byzantine Empire, delegated the primary responsibility for the Sicilian campaign to his younger brother. Sicily became Roger's war, his obsession, and his destiny. The nature of the fighting was slow and methodical, a series of difficult sieges punctuated by rare but decisive pitched battles. The defining moment of the early conquest came in 1063 at the Battle of Sarami. Roger, leading a tiny force of just over 130 knights, found himself confronted by a massive Saracen army of many thousands. Trapped and facing annihilation, the Normans prepared for a heroic last stand. According to the chroniclers, at the moment of greatest peril, a mysterious and dazzlingly clad knight appeared on a white horse, carrying a banner of the cross and charging into the enemy ranks. It was, they claimed, a vision of St. George himself, sent by God to aid his Christian soldiers. Inspired by this divine intervention, Roger led his handful of knights in a desperate, ferocious charge that shattered the nerve of the much larger Muslim army, which broke and fled in a panic. Whether a miracle or a testament to the terrifying effectiveness of the Norman cavalry charge, the victory at Sarami was total. It cemented Roger's reputation as a divinely favored commander and began the slow, inexorable process of grinding down the Saracen resistance, one walled city at a time. The 30-year dream had begun in earnest. The long and brutal 30-year war for Sicily, which had been the life's work of Roger de Hauteville, finally concluded in 1091. With the fall of the last Muslim stronghold, the entire island was now under Norman control. Roger, known to his contemporaries and to history as the Great Count, now faced the challenge that had confronted all successful Norman leaders: how to govern a newly conquered, culturally diverse land. But unlike his contemporary William the Conqueror, who had responded to this challenge in England with a near total dispossession of the native elite, Roger chose a remarkably different and far more pragmatic path. He understood that the island's immense wealth and prosperity were the products of its sophisticated multicultural society. To destroy that society would be to destroy the value of the prize he had fought so long to win. So he instituted a policy of extraordinary tolerance for the age. His Muslim subjects were allowed to practice their faith, live under their own laws, and crucially, keep their property in exchange for paying a special tax. He protected the Greek-speaking Christian communities and their Orthodox faith. He became the master of a land where the Muslim call to prayer could be heard alongside the ringing of Christian church bells. This wise and practical foundation, laid by the first Roger, would be built upon by his son, who would raise it into one of the most brilliant kingdoms of the medieval world. This son, also named Roger, who would go down in history as Roger II, inherited his father's Sicilian and Calabrian lands in 1101, initially under the powerful regency of his mother, Adelaide del Vasto. He was a man raised not in the damp confines of a Norman keep, but in the sun-drenched multicultural court of Sicily, a world where Greek, Arabic, and Latin were spoken around him from birth. He possessed his family's boundless ambition, but tempered it with a statesman's vision and a scholar's intellect. Over the next 2 decades, through a masterful combination of diplomacy, inheritance, and ruthless military campaigns, he accomplished what his uncle Robert Guiscard had never quite managed. He united all of the disparate Norman territories in southern Italy under his single rule, absorbing the lands of his squabbling cousins. He was now the master of a powerful, contiguous state stretching from the borders of Rome to the shores of Sicily. But a countship, however great, was not enough for a man of his vision. He wanted a crown. His opportunity came in 1130, with a schism in the papacy that saw two rival popes claiming the throne of St. Peter. While the rest of Europe dithered, Roger II acted decisively, offering his crucial military and financial support to one of the claimants, Anacletus II. His price for this support was a royal title. The grateful anti-pope readily agreed. And so, on Christmas Day of 1130, in the magnificent cathedral of Palermo, Roger II was anointed and crowned the first king of Sicily. The date was deliberately chosen for its immense symbolic power, echoing the Christmas coronations of Charlemagne, the father of European kingship, and of William the Conqueror in England. The Norman adventurers who had arrived in Italy a century earlier as little more than penniless mercenaries had now produced a king and a kingdom. The kingdom that Roger forged was a unique marvel of the Middle Ages, a hybrid state that consciously drew on the strengths of the three great cultures that now fell under its dominion. His royal court in Palermo was the most dazzling in Europe, a beacon of learning and opulence. His government was a masterpiece of syncretic administration. For his military and the loyalty of his barons, he relied on the Norman feudal system. But for the day-to-day running of his kingdom, for justice, finance, and administration, he ignored the relatively crude Norman methods and instead retained and expanded the sophisticated, efficient bureaucracies of his Byzantine, Greek, and Arab subjects. His chief ministers included Greek eunuchs who bore the grand titles of the Byzantine court and Arab emirs who oversaw the royal finances. Royal edicts and documents were routinely issued in three languages: Latin, Greek, and Arabic. His policy of tolerance was not just a philosophical ideal, it was the practical engine of his state. This unique fusion of cultures produced a breathtaking artistic and intellectual flowering. Roger was a great patron of learning, famously commissioning the great Arab geographer Muhammad al-Idrisi to produce the Tabula Rogeriana, a silver map and accompanying book that was the most accurate and comprehensive description of the world produced in its time. The architecture he commissioned is perhaps the most stunning testament to his vision. The churches built under his reign, such as his breathtaking Palatine Chapel in Palermo or the great Cathedral of Cefalù, are architectural wonders that defy simple categorization. They possess the solid, fortress-like layouts of Norman Romanesque churches, but their interiors are a riot of cultural fusion. Their walls are covered in shimmering golden mosaics of saints and angels, executed with all the sublime and solemn artistry of the finest Byzantine masters. Above, the ceilings are not stone vaults, but intricately carved and painted wooden muqarnas, the honeycomb-like decorative work that is a hallmark of Islamic architecture. It was a style that existed nowhere else on earth, a visual representation of the kingdom itself, a Norman body with a Byzantine soul and an Arab mind. Under the firm hand of its king, the kingdom of Sicily became a land of peace, order, and immense wealth, a centralized and tolerant society that stood in stark contrast to the feudal anarchy and religious persecution that so often characterized the rest of medieval Europe. While King Roger II was masterfully weaving together the threads of three great cultures to create his brilliant Sicilian kingdom, another, far more violent and religiously charged chapter of the Norman story was about to begin. The restless, acquisitive energy that had propelled the Normans across Europe had not been exhausted. It was merely seeking a new outlet. And in the year 1095, that outlet was provided in the most dramatic fashion imaginable. At the Council of Clermont in France, Pope Urban II delivered a sermon of such electrifying power that it set the entire continent ablaze. He called upon the knights of Christendom to cease their petty internal squabbles and embark upon a great armed pilgrimage, a holy war to wrest the sacred city of Jerusalem from the control of the Seljuk Turks. A wave of intense religious fervor swept across Europe, but for the Normans of southern Italy, the call to crusade was heard not just as a promise of spiritual salvation, but as a trumpet blast of worldly opportunity. It was a new, divinely sanctioned adventure, a chance to win land, wealth, and glory on a scale that dwarfed even their own spectacular achievements. The perfect embodiment of this fusion of piety and ambition was a man who seemed destined by his very nature to lead such an enterprise, Bohemond of Taranto. Bohemond was the firstborn son of the legendary Robert Guiscard, and he had inherited all of his father's cunning, his military genius, and his colossal ambition. He was, by all accounts, a physical giant, a man whose imposing stature and fearsome charisma could dominate any room or battlefield. The Byzantine princess, Anna Komnene, who observed him with a mixture of terror and grudging admiration, wrote that no man equal to Bohemond, either in strength or in courage, was ever seen in the land of the Romans. But despite his parentage and his talents, Bohemond was a deeply resentful and landless prince. His father's first marriage had been annulled, and he had been disinherited in favor of a younger, weaker half-brother. The crusade for him was a perfect, God-given chance to seize the great inheritance that fate had denied him. When the news of the Pope's call reached him, he was in the middle of a siege. In a moment of high theater, he is said to have called for his most expensive cloak, torn it to shreds on the spot, and fashioned the pieces into crosses for himself and his commanders, committing his formidable army to the holy cause. Bohemond and his nephew, the equally capable and ambitious Tancred, led a large and disciplined contingent of Italo-Norman knights on the long march east. Their journey eventually brought them, along with the other great armies of the First Crusade, to the gates of the magnificent, sprawling city of Constantinople, the capital of the Byzantine Empire. The emperor, Alexios Komnenos, greeted the arrival of these western armies with deep apprehension. He had asked the Pope for a few hundred mercenary knights to help him fight the Turks, and he had instead gotten a migration of tens of thousands of unpredictable, heavily armed warriors camped on his doorstep. The man he feared most of all was Bohemond. He had not forgotten that Bohemond's own father, Robert Guiscard, had spent the last years of his life trying to conquer the Byzantine Empire. He suspected correctly that Bohemond's pious declarations masked a familiar Norman land hunger. In a series of tense diplomatic encounters, two of the wiliest men of their age sized each other up. The emperor eventually forced the Crusader leaders to swear an oath, promising to return to him any former imperial lands they reconquered from the Turks. Bohemond, seeing no alternative, reluctantly swore the oath, though it is almost certain he had no intention of honoring it. The great test for the Crusader army and the great opportunity for Bohemond came at the ancient city of Antioch, a sprawling metropolis, once one of the great centers of Christianity. Antioch was protected by some of the most formidable fortifications in the world. Massive stone walls, studded with hundreds of towers. The siege of Antioch became a brutal, grinding affair that lasted for nearly 8 agonizing months. The Crusaders, plagued by starvation, disease, and the constant threat of a Turkish relief army, were on the verge of collapse. Throughout this ordeal, Bohemond consistently proved himself to be the most decisive and effective military leader, winning key skirmishes and holding the wavering army together. But while the other leaders dreamed of Jerusalem, Bohemond's gaze was fixed on the prize before him. Antioch, with its rich history and strategic location, would be the capital of the Eastern Principality he intended to create. He announced to the other crusade leaders that he would withdraw his desperately needed troops from the siege unless they agreed, so that if he found a way into the city, the prize would be his alone. Reluctantly, they agreed. Bohemond, true to his father's legacy, now turned from brute force to cunning. He secretly made contact with a disaffected Armenian Christian within the city, a tower captain named Firuz. Bribed with promises of gold and land, Firuz agreed to betray the city. On a moonless night in June of 1098, he lowered a leather rope from the section of the wall he commanded. A small, hand-picked groups of Bohemond's knights scaled the wall, overpowered the nearby guards, and rushed to open a gate for the waiting Crusader army. They poured into the sleeping city, and a terrible slaughter ensued. Antioch had fallen. Bohemond immediately raised his personal standard over the city's citadel, claiming it as his own in defiance of his oath to the Byzantine emperor. He had gambled everything, and he had won. While the main Crusader army would eventually march on to Jerusalem, Bohemond, the disinherited son of the Guiscard, remained behind, the proud and defiant ruler of his own new Norman state, the Principality of Antioch. Bohemond's banner, flying high over the citadel of Antioch, was a symbol of a spectacular personal triumph, but the celebration was dangerously premature. The Norman prince and his fellow crusaders had seized the city, but their victory had been a trap. Just 3 days after they had fought their way in, a vast Turkish relief army, led by the formidable Kerboga, Atabeg of Mosul, arrived and sealed the city from the outside. The hunters had become the hunted. The Crusaders were now the ones besieged, trapped within the walls of a city whose food supplies they had already plundered, with Kerboga's massive army camped outside, and the city's own citadel still held by a defiant Muslim garrison. The situation turned desperate with terrifying speed. Starvation set in, morale evaporated, and knights who had braved a 1,000-mile journey began to desert, slipping over the walls at night in a desperate bid for self-preservation. The Great Crusade seemed doomed to perish of hunger and despair in the city that was meant to be its crowning achievement. It was at this moment of absolute crisis that salvation appeared in the most unlikely of forms. A poor, uneducated Provençal peasant pilgrim named Peter Bartholomew came before the Crusade leaders, claiming to have received a series of visions from Saint Andrew. The saint, he said, had revealed to him the location of the most sacred relic in all of Christendom, the Holy Lance, The very spear that had pierced the side of Christ as he hung on the cross, which he claimed was buried beneath the floor of the city's Cathedral of St. Peter. This announcement is one of history's great mysteries. Was it a genuine, divinely inspired miracle, or was it a pious fraud, a desperate psychological ploy conceived by the clergy to rally their broken men? The crusade leaders themselves were divided. The papal legate was deeply skeptical, but others, including Bohemond, saw the immense potential of such a discovery. A digging party was organized, and after a day of fruitless labor in the cathedral, Peter Bartholomew himself leapt into the pit. A few moments later, he emerged, clutching a rusty spearhead. A wave of religious ecstasy swept through the starving army. God was with them. They had been sent a sign, fired with a renewed and unshakable faith. The Crusaders did the unthinkable. On the 28th of June, 1098, the gates of Antioch swung open, and the skeletal, half-starved Christian army marched out to face Kerboga's vastly superior force. With the Holy Lance carried before them as a battle standard, they charged. The Turkish army, a fractious coalition of rival emirs, was stunned by the suicidal audacity of the attack. They had expected a surrender, not an assault. In the face of the Crusaders' fanatical, desperate charge, the Turkish coalition wavered, broke, and then fled in a disorganized rout. Against all odds, the Normans and their allies had won a miraculous victory. The city of Antioch, and Bohemond's claim to it, was now secure. The state that Bohemond founded, the Principality of Antioch, was a classic Norman enterprise, adapted to the unique political landscape of the Near East. It was a feudal state in which Bohemond, as prince, granted castles and estates to his most loyal Norman and Frankish followers in exchange for military service. But it was also, by necessity, a colonial state. The new Latin Christian ruling class was a tiny minority, governing a vast and diverse native population of Greek Orthodox Christians, Armenian Christians, and Muslims. Unlike in England, but very much like the emerging situation in Sicily, survival depended on a degree of pragmatic tolerance. The Normans of Antioch were too few to simply displace the local population, and they depended on their skills as farmers, artisans, and merchants. For over a century and a half, the principality would survive as a lonely European outpost, a sliver of Latin Christendom carved out of the heart of the Levant. Its existence was one of almost constant, grinding warfare. Bohemond himself was captured by a rival Turkish emir in 1100 and spent 3 years in a dungeon before being ransomed. During his captivity and his later travels back to Europe to raise reinforcements, the principality was ably governed by his brilliant nephew, Tancred, who fought tirelessly to expand and defend its borders. The life of the Principality of Antioch was a precarious balancing act, surrounded on all sides by powerful enemies. To the north was the Byzantine Empire, which never forgave what it saw as Bohemond's theft of a rightful imperial city. To the east and south lay a constellation of rival Turkish and Arab emirates, who, though often fighting amongst themselves, could unite to present a mortal threat. The history of the principality is a litany of raids, skirmishes, and desperate battles fought under the brutal Syrian sun. The dream of Norman expansion eventually met a bloody end in 1119 at a battle that became known grimly as the Ager Sanguinis, the Field of Blood. The Antiochene army was ambushed by a force from Aleppo, and in the ensuing slaughter, its ruler and most of its knights were wiped out. The battle was a catastrophe from which the principality never fully recovered, though it would limp on for many more decades. Its glory days were over, its power broken. The great Norman adventure in the East had reached its violent, bloody apex and had begun its long and painful decline. While the Norman princes of Antioch were desperately carving out a precarious existence in the sun-scorched Levant, the original Norman heartland of England and Normandy was enjoying a period of uncharacteristic stability under its third king. The chaotic aftermath of the Conqueror's death had seen his sons engage in a bitter struggle for his inheritance. The second son, William Rufus, a brutal and effective but widely disliked king, had his reign cut short in the year 1100 by a stray arrow in a hunting accident, an event so politically convenient for his younger brother who was present at the hunt that whispers of assassination have echoed through the centuries. That younger brother, the clever and scholarly Henry I, seized the opportunity, outmaneuvering his feckless eldest brother, Robert Curthose, to reunite England and Normandy under a single, formidable ruler. For 35 years, Henry I governed with the same ruthless efficiency as his father, bringing up a welcome, iron-fisted peace and a sense of order to his Anglo-Norman realm. But all of this hard-won stability was built upon a fragile foundation, the life of a single, healthy male heir. That foundation was shattered on a cold November night in 1120, in one of the most infamous maritime disasters of the Middle Ages. King Henry was returning to England from Normandy, his court traveling in a flotilla of ships. His only legitimate son and heir, the 17-year-old William Adelin, traveled separately on the finest and fastest vessel in the fleet, the Blanche Neuf, or the White Ship. The young prince and his entourage, a glittering assembly of the heirs of the greatest families in the kingdom, spent the evening drinking heavily, making merry, and foolishly delaying their departure. In their haste to catch up to the king's fleet in the dark, the drunken helmsman steered the ship straight into a submerged rock just outside the harbor of Barfleur. The ship began to sink almost immediately, its hull ripped open. The prince, William Adelin, was quickly bundled into a small lifeboat and had a clear chance of survival. But as he was being rowed away, he heard the screams of his illegitimate half-sister, trapped on the sinking deck. In a moment of chivalric, fatal compassion, he ordered his boat to turn back. As they neared the wreck, dozens of other drowning nobles tried to clamber into the small boat, which was quickly swamped and sank, taking the heir to the throne down with it. Of the 300 souls on board, only one survived, a butcher from Rouen who clung to a piece of wreckage through the freezing night. When the news was finally broken to King Henry a day later, the chronicles say he collapsed in grief and never smiled again. The king's personal tragedy was also a catastrophic political crisis. He was now in his 50s, and his desperate attempts to produce a new male heir with his second wife failed. He was left with only one legitimate child, his daughter, Matilda. She was a formidable woman in her own right, the widow of the Holy Roman Emperor Henry I, a title that gave her an almost mythical status as the Empress. In an unprecedented and revolutionary move, King Henry decided to make her his successor. In 1127, he summoned all the great barons of England and Normandy, the most powerful men in his kingdom, and forced them to swear a solemn, sacred oath to recognize his daughter Matilda as their rightful ruler after his death. It was a radical solution to a desperate problem. A ruling queen was virtually unheard of, a concept alien and offensive to the deeply patriarchal warrior aristocracy of the Normans. To strengthen her position, Henry arranged for her to marry Geoffrey Plantagenet, the ambitious and powerful Count of Anjou. This too was a bitter pill for the Norman barons, who for generations had viewed the Angevins as their hereditary rivals. In 1135, King Henry VI died. The great barons of the realm, who had sworn their sacred oaths to Matilda on holy relics, now faced a moment of decision. Would they honor their word and accept a queen they disliked, married to an enemy they despised? The answer was a resounding no. While Matilda and her husband Geoffrey were preoccupied in Anjou, another claimant, a man with a weaker legal claim but far greater popular appeal, moved with lightning speed. This was Stephen of Blois, the Conqueror's own grandson. He was King Henry's favorite nephew, a charming, affable, and famously courageous knight who was well liked by the barons. While Matilda was a distant, haughty empress, Stephen was one of them. He raced across the Channel, secured the all-important royal treasury at Winchester, and with the backing of his brother, the powerful Bishop of Winchester, and the support of the city of London, he had himself crowned king. The oaths to Matilda were conveniently forgotten, brushed aside with the flimsy excuse that the late king had forced them to swear against their will. Matilda, however, was her father's daughter, proud, stubborn, and utterly convinced of her own rights. She refused to accept this blatant usurpation. Backed by her powerful uncle, the King of Scotland, and her fiercely loyal half-brother Robert, the Earl of Gloucester, she prepared to fight for her inheritance. The country began to polarize, as great families were forced to choose sides, often based on local rivalries and opportunities for personal gain rather than grand principles of loyalty. The iron grip that Henry VII had maintained on his kingdom was broken. Barons who had been cowed into submission for a generation now saw their chance to act as petty kings in their own lands. The stage was set for a devastating civil war, a conflict that would tear the Anglo-Norman world apart for nearly 2 decades, a grim period of breakdown and chaos that would be remembered by later chroniclers simply as the Anarchy. The breaking of the sacred oaths to Matilda plunged England into a darkness it had not known since the terrifying days of the Viking raids. The centralized power and royal justice, so brutally established by William the Conqueror and his son Henry III, dissolved almost overnight, and the country slid into the long, agonizing nightmare that the chroniclers would call the Anarchy. A contemporary monk, writing in the Peterborough Chronicle, left a harrowing account of these years, his words painting a grim picture of a society tearing itself apart. For every powerful man built his castles, he wrote, and they filled the land full of castles, and when the castles were made, they filled them with devils and evil men. They greatly oppressed the wretched men of the land with castle work. They took those whom they believed to have any goods, both by day and by night, men and women, and put them in prison for their gold and silver, and tortured them with unspeakable tortures. He concluded his lament with a phrase that perfectly captured the despair of the age. Men said openly that Christ and his saints slept. This was the price of a disputed succession, a kingdom where law had vanished, where robber barons ruled from their newly built fortresses, and where the common people suffered immensely. The war itself was not a clean series of decisive battles, but a messy, grinding, and deeply destructive conflict of attrition. It was a war of sieges, of raids, and of shifting allegiances, as local lords used the chaos to settle old scores and seize their neighbors' lands. The Empress Matilda landed in England in 1139 to press her claim in person, and for a time her cause seemed destined to triumph. At the Battle of Lincoln in 1141, her forces, led by her brilliant half-brother Robert of Gloucester, captured King Stephen himself. Stephen was thrown into a dungeon in Bristol, and Matilda marched on London to be crowned queen. But her victory was undone by her own character. Haughty, arrogant, and deaf to the advice of her allies, she quickly alienated the citizens of London with her demands for high taxes. A popular uprising drove her from the city just before her planned coronation. Later that year, her great champion, Robert of Gloucester, was himself captured by Stephen's forces. In the end, a grim parity was achieved. Matilda's side had the king, and Stephen's side had her most important general. A prisoner exchange was arranged, and the stalemate resumed. Neither side possessed the strength to deliver a knockout blow, and so the miserable war dragged on, year after agonizing year. As the original combatants grew weary, a new force began to emerge, a young man who possessed a dynamism and a political genius that far outstripped that of either his mother or his rival. This was Henry, Matilda's son, known as Henry Fitz-Empress. He was a force of nature, a man of restless, inexhaustible energy, who seemed to spend his entire life in the saddle, crisscrossing his domains with bewildering speed. From his father, Geoffrey Plantagenet, he inherited the French counties of Anjou, Maine, and Touraine. From his mother, he inherited the claim to England and direct rule of the Duchy of Normandy. He was already in his late teens, one of the most powerful magnates in France, a young lion preparing to claim his full inheritance. Then, in 1152, this already powerful young duke executed a political and marital masterstroke that altered the map of Europe. He married Eleanor of Aquitaine. Eleanor was not just any noblewoman. She was the most desirable heiress of her generation, the recently divorced wife of King Louis VII of France, and, in her own right, the Duchess of Aquitaine, a vast and wealthy territory that encompassed nearly a quarter of modern France. Their marriage was a breathtaking coup. At the age of just 19, Henry now found himself the master of an enormous, contiguous realm that stretched from the borders of Scotland in the north all the way to the Pyrenees Mountains in the south. This was the birth of a new political entity, a collection of territories so vast that historians would later call it the Angevin Empire. Henry now controlled more of France than the French king himself. Bolstered by the immense wealth and prestige of his new continental empire, Henry landed in England in 1153 for what was meant to be the final campaign of the Civil War. But by now, all sides were exhausted. The barons were tired of the endless, destructive conflict, and a new desire for peace was in the air. This desire was given a powerful push when Stephen's own son and heir, Eustace, died suddenly. With his own dynasty's future now uncertain, the aging and grief-stricken King Stephen was finally persuaded to negotiate. At Wallingford, by the banks of the Thames, the two sides hammered out a peace. The treaty was a masterpiece of compromise. Stephen would remain the undisputed King of England for the rest of his life, but he, in turn, would formally adopt his rival's son, Henry, as his own heir. The long and bloody war was over. The following year, in 1154, King Stephen died peacefully. Henry Fitz-Empress, the son of the Empress Matilda, crossed the Channel and unopposed ascended the throne as King Henry II of England. The Norman dynasty, born in the fire of Hastings, had finally guttered out in the misery of the anarchy. A new line of kings, the Plantagenets, now ruled an empire forged from the ashes of civil war. As Henry II, the first of the Plantagenet kings, began the monumental task of restoring order to an England shattered by civil war, the restless spirit of his Norman barons was already seeking new horizons. The vast Angevin Empire, stretching from Scotland to the Pyrenees, seemed to have finally contained the explosive, expansionist energy of the Normans. But on the wild western frontier of Henry's domains, on the borderlands between England and Wales, a new generation of Norman lords, hardened by a century of brutal frontier warfare, looked across the gray waters of the Irish Sea. They saw an island that to their eyes was a land of opportunity, a place ripe for the taking, governed by traditions and methods of warfare that seemed a world away from their own feudal order. Ireland in the middle of the 12th century was a land of breathtaking beauty, ancient learning, and endemic political fragmentation. It was a patchwork of over 100 small kingdoms, or tuatha, grouped into larger provincial realms like Leinster, Munster, Connacht, and Ulster. Over them all reigned a high king, but his authority was often more symbolic than real, and he ruled only with the consent of the other provincial kings. It was a society governed by the ancient and complex Bran laws, and its warfare, while constant, was often a ritualized affair of cattle raids and skirmishes between rival clans, rather than the Norman method of conquest, occupation, and subjugation by castle. This decentralized and turbulent political landscape, which had successfully resisted both the Romans and the Vikings, was dangerously vulnerable to the new, more organized form of warfare that the Normans had perfected. As had happened so often in the Norman story, the door was opened from the inside. The catalyst was a man named Diarmait Mac Murchada, or Dermot MacMurrough, the ambitious and brutal king of Leinster. In 1166, after a long and bitter power struggle, Dermot was deposed by his rivals and driven into exile. But Dermot was not a man to accept defeat. Burning with a desire for revenge, he took the extraordinary step of sailing to France to seek aid from the most powerful ruler in Europe, King Henry II. Henry, preoccupied with the immense task of governing his own empire, had no interest in leading an expedition himself, but he saw a low-risk opportunity. He gave Dermot a formal letter, granting him permission to recruit any knights from within his domains as mercenaries. Dermot, armed with this royal license, headed not to the settled heartland of England, but to the frontier of South Wales, the home of the Marcher Lords. These Marcher Lords were the descendants of the most aggressive of the original Norman conquerors, men who had spent generations fighting the Welsh and carving out their own semi-independent lordships. They were a uniquely tough, militarized, and land-hungry breed. Among them was a man who was perfectly placed to answer Dermot's call. Richard de Clare, the Earl of Pembroke, a man known to history by the formidable nickname Strongbow. Strongbow was a nobleman of high standing, but was out of favor with the king and in serious financial difficulty. Dermot made him an offer of breathtaking generosity. If Strongbow would raise an army and restore him to his throne in Leinster, Dermot would give him the hand of his daughter, Aoife, in marriage. And more importantly, Strongbow would be named as Dermot's legal heir, in line to inherit the entire kingdom of Leinster. For a restless and indebted Norman lord, it was the chance of a lifetime. The Norman invasion of Ireland began not as a single royal campaign, but as a series of private, opportunistic ventures. In 1169, a small vanguard of Marcher knights and their Welsh archers landed in Wexford. With their superior military technology, armored knights on war horses, disciplined formations of infantry, and deadly longbowmen, they won a series of shockingly easy victories against the larger but more poorly equipped Irish armies. Dermot was quickly restored to his throne. Then, in the summer of 1170, Strongbow himself arrived with the main force. He captured the key Viking-founded port cities of Waterford and Dublin with ruthless efficiency, cementing Norman control over the entire region. The speed and brutality of the Norman success stunned the Irish kings, who were accustomed to a very different way of war. Strongbow's spectacular success, however, now caused a problem. King Henry II, watching from across the water, became deeply alarmed. The last thing he wanted was a powerful, independent Norman state emerging on his western flank, especially one controlled by a vassal he did not entirely trust. Determined to assert his authority, Henry landed in Ireland himself in 1171 at the head of a massive, overwhelming army. This was a political masterstroke. There was no great battle. The Norman adventurers, including Strongbow, had no choice but to immediately submit to their king, handing over the cities and castles they had conquered. Henry then held a great court, and one by one, the various Irish kings and chieftains, awed by the sheer power of the Angevin monarch, also came to submit, recognizing him as their new overlord. The Pope, eager to bring the idiosyncratic Irish Church more in line with Roman authority, gave his official blessing to the new arrangement. The private, mercenary adventure of a few marcher lords had been co-opted and transformed into an official extension of the Angevin crown. A relationship had been forged, an entanglement of two islands that would shape the course of both their histories for the next 800 years. King Henry II, the man who had inherited a kingdom in chaos and forged it into the heart of a vast European empire, was a master of law, of governance, and of warfare. He had tamed rebellious barons, reformed the English legal system, and brought a new level of order and authority to his sprawling domains. Yet this great king, who could master a continent, proved utterly incapable of mastering his own family. His marriage to the brilliant and formidable Eleanor of Aquitaine had been a political masterstroke, but it was also a tempestuous and passionate union that produced a brood of sons who were as ambitious, energetic, and treacherous as their parents. The very strength and vitality that had created the Angevin Empire would now threaten to tear it apart from within. This was the tragedy of Henry II. His greatest failure was not a lost battle or a flawed law, but his own sons, the devil's brood. There was Henry, the eldest surviving son, known as the young king, who was crowned as his father's co-ruler in a bid to secure the succession, but was given no actual power, leaving him in a state of gilded, impotent frustration. There was Richard, his mother's favorite, a warrior of legendary prowess, and a troubadour of considerable talent, who ruled the restive duchy of Aquitaine with a firm hand. There was Geoffrey, the Duke of Brittany, clever, duplicitous, and a master of intrigue. And finally, there was John, the youngest, and his father's favorite, nicknamed Lackland, because he was initially granted no territory of his own. Clever, cruel, and congenitally untrustworthy, John would become one of the most infamous figures in English history. Goaded by their mother Eleanor, who eventually became estranged from Henry, and constantly manipulated by their great rival, the shrewd King of France, these sons spent the better part of 2 decades in a state of simmering or open rebellion against their own father. The pattern was set by the Great Revolt of 1173, when Henry the young king, Richard, and Geoffrey all rose up at once against their father in a bid to seize the real power they craved. But the old king was more than a match for them. Moving with the incredible speed that was his hallmark, Henry II crisscrossed his empire, crushing the rebellions, defeating his son's allies, and eventually forcing them to submit to his authority. He forgave them, but the trust was broken forever. The family was a viper's nest of shifting alliances, where brother plotted against brother and all plotted against their father. Henry the young king died of dysentery during one rebellion. Geoffrey was trampled to death in a tournament. This left Richard as the heir to the throne, a position that did nothing to quell his ambition. In the end, Richard, allied with the King of France, waged a final bitter war against his father. He hounded the aging and sick king across his own ancestral lands, defeating him in the field. Henry II was finally forced to submit to a humiliating peace, and it was then that he was shown a list of those who had betrayed him in this final conflict. At the very top of the list was the name of his youngest and most beloved son, John. The discovery broke the old king's heart. He died a few days later, defeated and abandoned, whispering, "Shame, shame on a conquered king." Richard, now known as the Lionheart, ascended the throne in 1189. He was the living embodiment of the chivalric ideal, a peerless general, a courageous warrior, and a charismatic leader of men. But he was also a profoundly neglectful king of England, a land he seemed to regard as little more than a bank to finance his true passion, crusading. Almost immediately, he liquidated royal assets and imposed heavy taxes to fund his participation in the Third Crusade, a grand expedition to reclaim Jerusalem from the great Muslim Sultan Saladin. For years, Richard was in the Holy Land, winning glory and a legendary reputation as he fought his Saracen rival to a standstill. But while the Lionheart was away, the Jackal was at play back home. His younger brother, John, saw his chance. He returned to England from his own lordship in Ireland and began to methodically undermine his brother's authority. He formed an alliance with Richard's great enemy, King Philip of France, spreading false rumors that Richard had been killed in the Holy Land and attempting to have himself declared king. John's treachery was blatant, but his rebellion was largely ineffective, as the kingdom remained loyal to its absent, heroic king. Richard's journey home from the crusade, however, became the stuff of legend. Shipwrecked in the Adriatic, he was captured by the Duke of Austria, whom he had insulted on crusade and handed over to the Holy Roman Emperor, who held the famous king for a colossal ransom. For over a year, the Lionheart was a prisoner in a German castle while England was bled dry by unprecedented taxes to raise the silver to buy his freedom. His eventual release and sudden dramatic return to England in 1194 instantly crushed John's pathetic rebellion. In a famous scene, the great warrior king magnanimously forgave his sniveling younger brother, declaring, "He is but a child who has had evil counselors." Richard would spend the last few years of his reign fighting to reclaim the lands and castles his rivals had seized in his absence. In 1199, while besieging a minor, insignificant castle in France, the great warrior made a foolish mistake. He was observing the battle without his full armor when a lone crossbowman on the castle walls fired a lucky shot, striking him in the shoulder. The wound turned gangrenous, and Richard the Lionheart died a slow, agonizing death. And so, through the death of all his older brothers, the throne of the vast Angevin Empire passed to the one son who had betrayed them all, John Lackland. When King John ascended to the throne of the Angevin Empire in 1199, he inherited a vast and magnificent, but deeply troubled realm. His brother, Richard the Lionheart, had been a legendary warrior, but his crusading zeal and massive ransom had bled the royal treasury dry, leaving the empire financially exhausted and administratively strained. To rule such a complex and overstretched collection of territories would have required a king with immense personal authority, diplomatic skill, and the unwavering loyalty of his barons. John, unfortunately, possessed none of these qualities. Where Richard had been charismatic, John was suspicious and cruel. Where Richard had commanded respect, John inspired distrust. An energetic and capable administrator in his own right, he was also prone to fits of lethargy and possessed a fatal streak of pettiness that consistently alienated his most powerful subjects. He was a man singularly ill-suited for the crisis that was about to engulf him, a crisis that he himself would carelessly ignite. The spark that set the Angevin Empire ablaze was not a great battle or a clash of armies, but a matter of the heart, a foolish and dishonorable marriage. In 1200, John, seeking to secure his southern French borders, married Isabella of Angoulême. The marriage was a strategic coup, but it came with a fatal flaw. Isabella was already formally betrothed to one of John's own powerful vassals, Hugh de Lusignan. In the rigid, honor-bound world of the feudal aristocracy, this was an unforgivable offense. John had not only stolen another man's bride, he had profoundly humiliated a powerful family and shown blatant contempt for the customs that held their world together. The insulted Lusignan family, denied justice by their immediate lord, John, did what feudal law allowed. They appealed to John's own overlord for his French lands, the King of France. The man who received this appeal was King Philip II, known as Philip Augustus, and he was the most dangerous enemy the Angevin kings had ever faced. While the Plantagenets were flamboyant, impulsive warriors, Philip was a patient, calculating, and utterly relentless political strategist. For his entire reign, he had pursued a single, overarching goal: the destruction of the Angevin Empire and the expulsion of the English kings from France. He had chipped away at its borders, sowing dissent among Henry II's sons, and conspiring with John against Richard. The appeal of the Lusignans now gave him the perfect legal weapon he had been waiting for. As the feudal sovereign of the Duke of Normandy, Philip had the legal right to summon his vassal, John, to his royal court in Paris to answer the charges. John, an anointed king in his own right, haughtily refused to appear. This was exactly what Philip had anticipated. John's refusal was a clear breach of his feudal obligations. In 1202, Philip's court declared John a contumacious vassal and proclaimed all of his French fiefs, Normandy, Anjou, Aquitaine, everything, to be forfeit and legally confiscated by the French crown. The trap was sprung. Philip now had the legal pretext he needed to launch an all-out war. The subsequent campaign was a military catastrophe for John, a failure so complete that it earned him the humiliating nickname Soft Sword. Philip's armies swept into Normandy, and John's response was a disastrous mix of initial energy followed by inexplicable lethargy and paranoia. He failed to lead his armies effectively, distrusted his own commanders, and retreated to England, leaving his continental strongholds to fend for themselves. The symbolic and strategic heart of the Norman defense was Chateau Gaillard, the magnificent and supposedly impregnable fortress that Richard the Lionheart had built at immense cost to guard the river Seine and protect the capital, Rouen. For 6 grueling months, through the winter of 1203–1204, the French army besieged the great castle. Its garrison fought with heroic determination, but John failed to send a relief force. In March of 1204, French soldiers finally found a weak point, a chapel latrine chute, and fought their way inside. The fall of Chateau Gaillard sent a shockwave across the duchy. If the Lionheart's masterpiece could not be held, nothing could. The morale of the Norman defenders collapsed, and the rest of the duchy, including the ancient capital of Rouen, fell with shocking speed. The loss was total and irreversible. Normandy, the ancestral homeland of the English monarchy, the duchy from which William the Conqueror had launched his great enterprise a century and a half earlier, was gone forever. The neighboring county of Anjou, the paternal heartland of the Plantagenet dynasty, fell soon after. The vast continental empire built by Henry II had crumbled to dust in less than 5 years. This military defeat had a profound and lasting social consequence. For generations, the Anglo-Norman aristocracy had been a cross-channel entity, with families holding vast estates in both England and Normandy. Now, King Philip forced them to make a choice. They could keep their lands in his kingdom and be his vassals, or they could keep their lands in England and be vassals of King John, but they could not have both. The link was severed. The great families were forced to choose their primary allegiance, and those who chose England began for the first time to see themselves not as Normans or Angevins who happened to rule England, but as Englishmen. John's disastrous failure on the battlefield had inadvertently set his kingdom on a new course, one that would, over time, forge a new and distinct English identity in the halls of power. While the Norman legacy in the north was being irrevocably altered, as King John's failures severed the English monarchy from its ancestral homeland, the other great Norman kingdom in the sun-drenched Mediterranean was embarking on its own strange and brilliant final chapter. The direct male line of the de Hauteville dynasty, which had begun with the landless sons of a minor baron and culminated in the magnificent King Roger II, eventually died out. The inheritance of the great Sicilian kingdom passed to Roger's daughter, Constance. In a marriage of immense political significance, she was wed to Henry VI of the Hohenstaufen dynasty, the son of the legendary German emperor Frederick Barbarossa. With this union, the fate of the Norman kingdom became entangled with the grand and turbulent politics of the Holy Roman Empire, a fusion that would produce one of the most remarkable and controversial rulers of the entire Middle Ages. Their son was Frederick II. His childhood was the stuff of grim fairy tales. Both his imperial father and his Norman mother died when he was just a boy, leaving him an orphan king in a land of intrigue and a pawn in the great game of papal politics. He grew up not in the cloistered safety of a royal court, but in the chaotic, vibrant, and dangerous streets of Palermo. It was a city where Latin, Greek, and Arabic were spoken in the marketplaces, where Christian, Muslim, and Jewish scholars debated in hidden courtyards. For years, the young king was neglected, sometimes living in poverty, protected only by the loyalty of a few and his own precocious wits. This unique and perilous upbringing forged a unique kind of ruler. He emerged from the crucible of his youth, fluent in 6 languages, intellectually curious to a degree unheard of in his time, and possessed of a deep skepticism for all forms of dogma and tradition. He was a Norman by blood, but a Sicilian by soul, a true product of the cultural melting pot his grandfather Roger II had created. Upon coming of age, Frederick revealed himself to be a man of almost supernatural talent. He secured his Sicilian kingdom, crossed the Alps into Germany to claim his paternal inheritance, and had himself crowned Holy Roman Emperor. His contemporaries, stunned by his vast array of talents and his almost complete disregard for the conventions of his age, gave him a fitting nickname, Stupor Mundi, the wonder of the world. He was a ruler who seemed to belong more to the Italian Renaissance than to the High Middle Ages. He was a poet, a lawgiver, a scientist, a statesman, and in the eyes of his enemies, a heretic of the highest order. His royal court was not a place of jousts and chivalric romances, but a center of intense intellectual and scientific inquiry. He was an obsessive naturalist, and his book on falconry, De Arte Venandi cum Avibus, The Art of Hunting with Birds, was no mere nobleman's pastime. It was a revolutionary work of empirical science, based on years of meticulous observation and experimentation, that dismissed the received wisdom of Aristotle in favor of what he could see with his own eyes. His curiosity was boundless and sometimes ghoulish, if the chronicles written by his enemies are to be believed. They tell lurid tales of his experiments, of raising children in total silence to discover the natural language of mankind, or of feeding 2 men identical meals and then sending one to sleep and one to hunt, before disemboweling them both to see how their digestion had differed. True or not, these stories capture the essence of a man driven by a relentless and sometimes terrifying rationalism. In Sicily, he governed not as a feudal king, but as a true autocrat. With his constitutions of Melfi, issued in 1231, he swept away the tangled web of feudal custom and created a modern, centralized state, run by salaried professional administrators with a system of justice and taxation that applied to all, baron and peasant alike. It was a legal masterpiece that placed all power squarely in the hands of the king. Yet this brilliant, modern ruler was viewed with absolute horror by the papacy. The popes, finding their territories in central Italy now encircled by an emperor who ruled both Germany and Sicily, saw Frederick as a mortal threat to their independence. His intellectualism, his employment of loyal Muslim bodyguards, and his apparent religious indifference gave them the perfect weapon. They denounced him as a blasphemer, a sultan in a Christian crown, and ultimately as the Antichrist himself. He was excommunicated multiple times, and his life was a near constant state of war with Rome. In one of the most bizarre episodes of the age, the excommunicated emperor embarked on a crusade, and instead of fighting, he sat down with the Sultan of Egypt, a man with whom he shared a deep intellectual curiosity, and peacefully negotiated the return of Jerusalem to Christian rule. It was a stunning diplomatic triumph, for which the Pope, furious at being denied a holy war, excommunicated him yet again. Frederick was the final, dazzling flare of the Norman Sicilian experiment, a man of Norman blood who ruled a kingdom of three cultures, a beacon of proto-Renaissance brilliance in a deeply medieval world. The death of Frederick II, the wonder of the world, in 1250, marked the beginning of the end for the great Norman-founded kingdom of Sicily. The brilliant, multicultural, and fiercely independent state that had been forged by the de Hauteville and brought to its intellectual zenith by their Hohenstaufen heir was now caught in the unforgiving grip of papal politics. The popes in Rome, who had been Frederick's mortal enemies, were utterly determined to eradicate his dynasty, which they reviled as a viper's brood. They declared a crusade not against the infidel, but against Frederick's own heirs, his sons Conrad and the brilliant illegitimate son Manfred, who fought desperately to hold their father's kingdom together. The papacy began to search all of Europe for a champion, a loyal Catholic prince who would be willing to invade southern Italy, destroy the last of the Hohenstaufen, and rule the kingdom as a faithful vassal of the Holy See. They found their man in Charles of Anjou. Charles was the younger brother of the pious King Louis IX of France, and he was the absolute antithesis of the rulers who had governed Sicily for the past century and a half. Where the Norman and Hohenstaufen kings had been culturally curious and famously tolerant, Charles was rigid, grimly orthodox, and utterly convinced of French cultural superiority. Where they had been brilliant innovators, he was a ruthless and conventional consolidator of power. Backed by the limitless wealth of the French crown and the spiritual authority of the Pope, Charles invaded Italy in 1266. He met and killed Manfred at the Battle of Benevento. 2 years later, he crushed a final, desperate attempt to reclaim the kingdom, led by Frederick's 16-year-old grandson, Conradin. Charles captured the boy king, subjected him to a mockery of a trial, and had him publicly beheaded in a square in Naples. With that single brutal act, the line of Frederick Barbarossa, of Roger II, and of Robert Guiscard was extinguished forever. The French Angevin dynasty now ruled the south. Charles's reign was one of cold, efficient, and deeply resented oppression. One of his first acts was to move the capital from the vibrant, cosmopolitan Palermo in Sicily to the mainland city of Naples, a symbolic gesture that downgraded the island that had been the very heart of the kingdom. He and his French knights and administrators treated their new subjects with contempt. They imposed crippling taxes to fund Charles's grandiose ambitions of conquering Constantinople and building a Mediterranean empire. The delicate balance of cultures that had been the genius of the Norman kingdom was shattered. The golden age of Sicily was over, replaced by a grim new era of foreign domination. For nearly 2 decades, a silent, bitter resentment festered across the island, a powder keg of hatred waiting for a single spark. That spark came on Easter Monday, March 30th, 1282, in an event of such dramatic, explosive violence that it has echoed through the centuries. On that evening, as the citizens of Palermo were gathered outside a church for the evening prayer service known as Vespers, a group of French soldiers began to harass the local women. According to the traditional story, one French sergeant, Drouet, made an unwanted advance on a young married woman. Her husband, enraged by the public dishonor, drew a hidden knife and stabbed the sergeant, killing him on the spot. That single act of defiance, that sudden flash of steel, was all it took. A cry went up from the crowd, Morte ai Francesi, death to the French, and the simmering hatred of 2 decades erupted into a city-wide massacre. Mobs swarmed through the streets of Palermo, hunting down any Frenchmen they could find. They stormed the inns and the barracks, slaughtering the soldiers of the Angevin garrison. It is said they would hold up any stranger and force them to say the Sicilian word for chickpea, Sicily, a word whose pronunciation a French tongue could not master, and those who failed the test were cut down immediately. The bloody uprising in Palermo, which has become known to history as the Sicilian Vespers, spread like wildfire across the entire island. From town to town, the Sicilians rose up, slaughtering their French governors and garrisons. While the romantic tale tells of a spontaneous popular revolt, many historians believe it was at least partially guided by a pre-existing conspiracy of nobles, secretly backed by the other great powers of the Mediterranean, who feared a Charles of Anjou's ambition. But spontaneous or not, the rebels knew they could not stand alone against the full might of Charles's kingdom. They sent emissaries to King Peter III of Aragon, a powerful Spanish monarch whose wife Constance was Manfred's daughter and the last direct descendant of the Norman Hohenstaufen line. Peter, who had been building a fleet under the pretense of launching a crusade, accepted the offer of the Sicilian crown. He landed his army on the island, and a long and bloody war ensued. The result was the permanent sundering of the kingdom the Normans had built. The island of Sicily passed into the sphere of the Spanish crown of Aragon, while the mainland portion of the kingdom, ruled from Naples, remained in the hands of Charles of Anjou's descendants. The unified kingdom of Sicily was no more, and the last vestiges of the unique Norman era in the Mediterranean were finally swept away in a tide of blood and rebellion. The dynasties and empires that the Normans forged with such ferocious ambition have long since crumbled into the dust of history. The borders they drew have been redrawn 100 times, and their very name as a distinct people has faded from the world. Yet their legacy endures, not in the fading ink of chronicles, but in the unyielding permanence of stone. To stand before a Norman castle or to walk through the nave of a Norman cathedral is to feel the weight of their power and the sheer scale of their vision. Their architecture, a distinct and powerful regional variant of the Romanesque style, was a direct expression of their character. It is an architecture of conquest, of faith, of immense self-confidence, and of a genius for imposing a new and dramatic order upon the landscape. The Norman architectural signature is unmistakable. It is above all an architecture of mass and solidity. Their buildings, whether for God or for war, are characterized by immense, thick walls supported by huge, round piers, creating a sense of overwhelming fortress-like strength. Their defining feature is the simple, elegant, and powerful rounded arch, used for doorways, windows, and the great hall vaulted ceilings of their churches. While later Gothic architecture would delight in intricate, lace-like decoration, Norman ornamentation was bold, energetic, and geometric. They covered their arches and doorways with deeply carved patterns of chevrons, billets, and diamonds, patterns that give their buildings a sense of rugged, almost barbaric splendor. Across Europe, they expressed their dual identity as warriors and pious patrons through two archetypal structures, the Great Keep and the Great Cathedral, the twin pillars of their New World Order. Nowhere is this legacy more pronounced than in England, a country whose landscape they fundamentally reshaped. They were the great castle builders, and the evolution of their fortifications tells the story of their conquest. The initial, hasty, earth and timber Motte and Bailey forts were soon replaced by colossal stone keeps. The quintessential example is the White Tower, the heart of the Tower of London, begun by William the Conqueror himself. It was a stark, white, menacing statement of power, looming over the largest city in his new kingdom, a permanent reminder to the resentful Londoners of who was now in charge. This pattern was repeated across the realm, with great keeps at Rochester, Dover, and Colchester, each designed to dominate the surrounding territory. At the same time, the Normans began a campaign of ecclesiastical rebuilding on a breathtaking scale. Almost every major Anglo-Saxon cathedral was torn down and replaced with a new, far grander structure in the Norman style. The grandest of them all is Durham Cathedral, a building of almost overwhelming power and beauty, perched high on a cliff above the River Wear. Its vast nave, with its colossal, incised columns and its revolutionary ribbed vault, one of the very first in Europe and a direct precursor to the Gothic, is one of the great triumphs of medieval engineering, a true testament to the Norman fusion of piety and power. In the sun-drenched kingdom of Sicily, this Norman architectural DNA mutated into something entirely new and utterly unique. Here, the conquerors did not simply impose their own style. They presided over an astonishing fusion of the artistic traditions of the three cultures they now ruled. The great churches of the Sicilian kings are masterclasses in this hybrid genius. The Palatine Chapel in Palermo or the Cathedral at Monreale have the solid, basilican layout and rounded arches of a Norman church. But to step inside is to be transported into another world. Every available surface of the interior is covered in shimmering gold mosaics of Christ, the Virgin, and the saints, executed by the finest Byzantine craftsmen in the solemn, ethereal style of Constantinople. Yet if you look up, the ceiling is not a stone vault, but an intricately carved and painted wooden honeycomb of muqarnas, a masterpiece of Islamic artistry that would be perfectly at home in a mosque in Cairo or a palace in Cordoba. This glorious fusion, a Norman body, a Byzantine skin, and an Arab heart, was a deliberate expression of the king's power over their diverse peoples, a style of architecture that could have been created nowhere else on earth. This pattern of adaptation and dominance can be seen across the Norman world. In their original Duchy of Normandy, the great abbeys built by William and his wife Matilda in Caen provided the blueprint for many of the churches they would later build in England. And far to the east, in the Crusader states, the Normans and their Frankish allies built some of the most formidable castles the world has ever seen. Fortresses like Croix des Chevaliers were the ultimate expression of military architecture, blending European concepts of the concentric castle with the defensive innovations they learned from their Byzantine and Muslim enemies. Whether in the grim, gray keeps of England, the glittering cathedrals of Sicily, or the rugged castles of the Levant, the Norman legacy in stone is a story of power, permanence, and a remarkable ability to absorb and repurpose the skills of the people they conquered, creating something new, enduring, and uniquely their own. We have followed the trail of the Northmen across 1,000 miles and 300 years of history. We have seen them emerge from the Viking longships, a chaotic and terrifying force of nature, and transform themselves into the most disciplined and ambitious state builders of the Middle Ages. We have witnessed their conquests of England, of southern Italy, of Sicily, and of Antioch. We have stood in the halls of their glittering, multicultural courts, and on the bloody battlefields where their iron will reshape the map of Europe. And yet, after this breathtaking journey, we are left with a final, profound paradox. Where did they all go? For all their spectacular success, the Normans are a people who vanished from history, a conquering race that was, in the end, conquered by the very cultures they came to dominate. Their disappearance was a slow and quiet process, a testament to their own greatest strength, their adaptability. In England, the great catastrophe of King John's reign, the loss of Normandy itself, severed the umbilical cord to the continent. The Anglo-Norman barons, forced to choose their allegiance, became simply English. Over the next 2 centuries, through intermarriage and the slow, triumphant re-emergence of a French-infused English language, the line between the conqueror and the conquered blurred and then vanished entirely. In Sicily, their most brilliant creation, the Norman elite was always a tiny minority. After the male line of the de Hautevilles died out, the kingdom passed to German and then to French and Spanish rulers, and the distinct Norman element was simply absorbed and diluted into the rich multicultural fabric of the island, leaving behind only their magnificent hybrid architecture as a testament to their former glory. In the Crusader state of Antioch, they were a colonial outpost, a ruling class that was eventually and inevitably overwhelmed and expelled. And in Normandy itself, the homeland, the duchy was absorbed into the growing kingdom of France, its people and its identity becoming simply French. The Normans, it seems, were too successful, too adaptable, and too pragmatic to remain apart. They were the ultimate catalyst, a people who changed everything they touched, and in the process, changed themselves out of existence. Yet if their name is gone, their legacy is embedded so deeply in the foundations of the modern Western world that it is almost invisible, like the air we breathe. In the realm of law and governance, their impact was revolutionary. In England, their imposition of a centralized, powerful monarchy and a uniform system of royal justice laid the essential groundwork for the development of the English common law, a system that would be exported across the globe. Their genius for administration, captured in the astonishing detail of the Domesday Book, created a tradition of efficient bureaucratic governance that was centuries ahead of its time. Their influence on the English language was perhaps their most intimate and enduring legacy. The fusion of their aristocratic French with the sturdy Germanic tongue of the Anglo-Saxons created the richest and most versatile vocabulary on earth, a language that possesses a unique dual heritage, giving us two words for almost everything: the earthy and the ethereal, the common and the courtly, words like freedom and liberty, kingly and royal, ask and demand. So who were they, these restless, brilliant, and ruthless people? They were a people of profound contradictions. They were sincerely, and sometimes fanatically, pious, yet their piety never seemed to stand in the way of their breathtaking greed. They were warriors of unmatched ferocity, capable of acts of shocking brutality, like the harrying of the North. Yet they could also create kingdoms of remarkable tolerance and legal sophistication. They were, perhaps, the perfect embodiment of the medieval spirit, caught between the brutal pragmatism of the warrior and the soaring spiritual ambition of the cathedral builder. They were the last and most successful of the Vikings, yet they were also the vanguard of a new European order, their energy and ambition acting as the engine of change wherever they went. And so our long journey comes to its end. The story of the Normans is a reminder that history is a river, constantly flowing, constantly changing, and that even the most powerful and dynamic of peoples eventually merge with the current and flow into the great ocean of what comes after. Their echo is all around us, in the language we speak, in the laws that shape our societies, and in the quiet, enduring majesty of the stones they left behind. As you settle into sleep, perhaps you can hear it too, a fading echo on the wind, the creak of a longship's oar, the clang of a blacksmith's hammer on an anvil, the whisper of a prayer in a vast, cold cathedral. All the sound and fury has faded now, leaving only peace and a story, wishing you the deepest and most restful of slumbers. Good night.